She's an arch-paladin who was investigating the bodies of dead paladins. She's holding a mirror that's a sacred relic and shows the past and the future. Her assistant begs her not to use the mirror because the last one broke. She laughs and swears there's no danger since it only breaks if it reflects a great demon. She points the mirror at the bodies and sees a guy drinking demon blood right before killing the paladin. When the guy shows up transformed, the mirror explodes in her hand. Both of them freeze in shock because there's only one explanation. That lunatic is on the level of a great demon. This is Kadim, no title, no status, living with just one gift: drink demon blood and turn into a monster. The stronger the demon, the stronger he gets. But that power comes with a huge price. He already strangled his own friend thinking she was a monster. His coldness is terrifying. To give you an idea of how strong this guy is, he stormed a hideout of 100 bandits alone and wiped them out like it was nothing. All he had to do was chug his energy drink to turn into a full demon and start ripping everyone's heads off. The leader shot him in the back with a crossbow, but he just turned around and caught the arrow with his teeth. In the end, the boss ended up on his knees, scared to death just from the protagonist's aura. This guy is terror itself. But to understand how he got so broken, we need to go back to the day he woke up in this world. One day, our MC ended up falling asleep after work while drinking a beer and gaming. But when he woke up, he was in the game world. Elsewhere, a fierce white-haired woman tells Kadim to be careful, because demons were everywhere. The big guy moves toward the enemies and says he would take care of them, leaping toward the giant boss, a two-faced creature that is startled to see the human in front of it. With one attack, the MC splits the two-faced monster in half, chopping it into several pieces that fall to the ground. Kadim then gets up, realizing that, as expected, the demon realm had high-level monsters right from the start, and the path to the Demon King was going to be difficult. Then, turning around and seeing some fireballs, the MC realizes he had gone too far ahead and would definitely get chewed out by Melissa. Then an explosion happens. From afar, a redhead starts shouting, calling for Kadim, complaining that he had run off and charged ahead alone like that. Suddenly, a knight draws his golden sword, passing through some demons, slicing them down without mercy. Gale then asks Melissa to save the lecture for after the battle, because dealing with the monsters was more important. Seeing Gale act like a fairy tale hero, Melissa mocks him. Meanwhile, a priestess girl was casting a buff and saying she was worried about Kadim, because the berserker was pushing himself too hard. But at that moment a creature appears beside her. However, it is quickly taken down with a blow to the head by the priest Gordon, who tells Cyril not to worry after all. Kadim had his reasons and they should talk to him after the battle. Our MC watches from afar as his allies defeat some opponents. The young man introduces himself as Kadim, someone who is on the front line of the hero's party, formed to defeat the great demon and the great warrior of Atala, the god of battle and savagery, besides also being the person who transmigrated into this game. The game's main story was simple. A hero received a divine revelation to kill the great demon, gathering companions to defeat him. For a man who had never even killed a fly, living in that world was extremely difficult. We then see the MC drink something black, beginning to undergo some mutations, while several monsters charge toward him. A skill called Blood Berserk rewards the MC for drinking a demon's blood with a buff. While completely delirious and with his body changed, Kadim begins defeating the creatures. He destroys several enemies, only wanting to finish this and leave this world. Then, even ripping out one of the creature's organs and devouring it. Then, beginning to scream with a completely monstrous appearance. Sometime later, the boy was on top of a pile of corpses devouring like a madman what was left of the enemies. At that moment, a demoness appears there. Kadim quickly grabs her by the neck, saying that he was going to devour all those damn demons. With a terrifying smile, he comments that he would drink every drop of the creature's blood. Then moving in to finish her off, a light appears, blinding Kadim and stopping him from continuing. Then a familiar voice tells the young man to wake up to reality. Then, when he looks ahead, he realizes he is holding Melissa, almost finishing suffocating her. The boy then lets go of the girl and becomes confused, not understanding why he had done that to his friend. Devastated, the young man collapses onto the pile of corpses, realizing he had reached a point where he couldn't even recognize his companions, and his skill, capable of granting an enormous buff, was also slowly destroying his sanity. The demon blood that used to be disgusting had now become sweet, and his sanity was breaking down more and more, so we see the young man sinking into a sea of madness. But before that happens completely, Melissa appears, hugging him from behind. The girl says she is fine, so her friend didn't need to worry. Besides that, the young man had been protecting the group all this time, and now it was her turn to protect him. Cyril and Gordon also arrived there, saying they would do everything possible not to let Kadim go insane. Gordon even says that if the young man went insane, he would smack him on the head. Gale arrives asking if the berserker had rested enough, because it was time to leave. After all, they needed to defeat the great demon together and save the world. Then extending his hand to his friend, our MC shakes the hero's hand, and so they continue the journey, even though they are mentally broken. Sometime later, we see Gale ordering Kadim to do something. The Berserker appears with his axe at the Demon King's back. The creature even tries to turn around to counterattack, but ends up being finished off and having its head severed from its body. Gale, though exhausted, celebrates that everything is over. The Demon King's body starts spraying ketchup and ends up falling to the ground. Seeing that scene, Melissa is left frozen, wondering if this hell had finally truly ended. Gordon places his hand on the girl's shoulder, saying that by the grace of the god Elga, it was all over. Suddenly, an enormous light appears, blinding and illuminating the whole place. Cyril falls to her knees on the ground. Confused, she wonders where Kadim was. At that moment, the Berserker was running toward the light. Gale tells the young man to stop. After all, they had no way of knowing what it was. Before leaving, the MC stops for a moment, turning around, looking at his companions, and saying it had been an honor to meet them in person. Even with Gale insisting that he not go, Kadim passes through the light. An even stronger ray of light is emitted everywhere, then disappearing. Seeing this, Cyril falls to her knees, completely devastated. She calls Kadim's name, hoping he will return. After passing through the light, Kadim finds himself walking through an endless darkness. The boy starts thinking about what he would do when he returned to the real world. As he walks a little farther, he thinks that unfortunately, he didn't get to say goodbye to his companions, and that made him feel awful. On top of that, he would never be able to see them again, and Kadim, the great warrior of Atala, was gone forever. The MC comes across a door and thinks it is the way out to his world, but when he sees something, the boy falls into despair. Completely crushed, he refuses to believe that this was real. Then he starts laughing like a madman. A strong light covers the young man while he keeps laughing non-stop. We then see that Khan Steam saw a screen that reads starting the game. In an unknown place, some bandits were being escorted by guards. The caravan keeps moving for a while. Two bandits try to say that they didn't commit any crime and are innocent, but are quickly scolded by a guard. This makes the idiots shut up. Annoyed, the guard complains that the trash was noisy today. Suddenly, an old man calls out to the officer and claims to be innocent, explaining that he had never sold demonic products and that someone had framed him. Hearing that, the guard understands everything. In his head, the officer comments that there was always someone blaming innocent people to meet the criminal quota, and even though he was young, the paladin was already doing that kind of thing. However, if he interfered, his head would end up on that spear. So the young man asks the old man if he was doubting the word of a paladin of Elga, and the man denies it. Then the soldier orders the merchant to go back to his place, and though saddened, the old man obeys. Seeing the man return to his place, the soldier knows he no longer has any chance of surviving, and that was truly sad. But putting that aside, there was something more important. After all, he wanted to know how these guys had caught a barbarian. The caravan keeps moving together for a while longer. Our protagonist was confused, wondering what the hell was going on. After all, this body was familiar, but his power was gone. Not only that, but the madness consuming his mind had also disappeared. Since that damn text said new game, the young man concludes that he had restarted the story. But even so, things were strange, because not even in real life did the game ever start like this. Suddenly, an old man calls Kandim and offers him a root, asking the boy to chew it on the way because it would make the trip less boring. This leaves the berserker confused. The old man says he had once been helped by barbarians, and Kandim looked like them, which was why he was offering the root. Kandim accepts the gift and puts it in his mouth. Then the old man asks how the MC got caught, and the barbarian replies that he doesn't know. Making conversation, the old man explains that the paladins and priests of the Empire of Lucanian were hostile toward heretics. Hearing that makes Kandim confused, because Lucanian had not been an empire in the past, and he was probably in a world with a different setup. The berserker then asks where they were going, discovering that it was to the capital of the empire, the holy city of Lucanon, where he and the other criminals would be summoned by the inquisitors of Elga and judged for their crimes. He then feels relieved, since he would not be finished off immediately because of the trial. The villager is confused by this lack of concern, explaining that the inquisitors are torture-loving psychopaths, and when they saw a heretic like Kadim, they would treat him like a toy, doing the worst things to the barbarian's body. The paladin commander interrupts the old man's speech by piercing his chest and making him hit the ground bleeding. The blonde man states that anyone who insulted the agents of the god Elga would be condemned to death. Right after that, the paladin looks back, turning with his horse, and pointing his spear at Kadim while asking if the barbarian was the one who caused this commotion. The bastard says that he would spare the barbarian's life if he knelt and begged for his life. Kandim is not intimidated, and even lets out a laugh, making the paladin extremely angry as he feels disrespected. Without hesitating, the idiot charges with his spear, but ends up getting startled when he sees the criminal in front of him grab his weapon. Furious, the blonde tries to pull the spear back, but fails, then ordering the barbarian to stop it. The MC obeys, letting go of the spear just as the paladin puts force into pulling it, making the idiot almost fall backward. This leaves the blonde completely furious, threatening the criminal. Before he can take any action, the berserker appears in front of him, hitting him with a powerful blow using his shoulder. When the dust settles, the paladin is lying on the ground, together with his horse. Even after that attack, the blonde manages to survive and recover his spear, then questioning how the heretic dared to wound an agent of God. After recovering slightly, the paladin gets up, raising his spear. Kadim immediately recognizes this movement. The blonde begins to recite a few words, causing a light to appear above his head. After focusing his attack, he points his spear at Kadim, getting ready and starting to run toward the criminal to impale him. Kadim crosses his arms and realizes there is no way to dodge. Then, struck by the paladin's blow, the barbarian is thrown against a carriage, and his shackles break in the process. The powerful blow leaves a huge mark on the ground and a huge hole in the barbarian's chest. As he walks toward his enemy, the paladin is impressed that Kadim survived, then mocking the criminal's ugliness. The barbarian gets irritated because he wasn't supposed to be struggling against a guy like this, even with his stats reset and only his unique trait, Blood Berserk, and if there had been a lesser demon nearby, he wouldn't be in this situation. Looking around, the MC wonders how he's going to get out of this situation, until he senses a familiar scent beside him. At that moment, the paladin approaches, praising Kadim's endurance, and telling the berserk to obtain forgiveness through death. But the idiot ends up smelling something really awful. Suddenly, Kadim stands up laughing like a madman, and declaring that the god Elga had chosen him, not the rookie paladin. Without hesitation, the berserk smashes one of the crates beside him, pulling the head of an ugly monster out of it. Kadim lets out a smile, raising the goblin's head up and squeezing it, then drinking the creature's blood. This disgusts everyone around him, especially the paladin. Confused, the blonde wonders if Kadim had gone crazy, and that was why he was drinking demon blood. Too disgusted to get close, the man orders one of the soldiers to finish off the barbarian. The poor soldier points his blade at Kadim, and even while trembling, tells the barbarian to die. Then advancing toward him, exuding a red aura, Kadim grabs the head of the soldier in front of him. The man wipes his mouth and starts squeezing his enemy's head as the man begs for his life. This scene leaves the paladin disgusted, but without mercy, the MC squeezes and blows up the poor soldier. Completely covered in filth, the boy thinks that even a lesser demon would do. Kadim begins to undergo a transformation and scream like a demon. The surrounding soldiers, seeing this, call the barbarian a monster. Trembling in fear, they begin dropping their weapons and running away from there. The paladin even tries to stop them, saying that anyone who fled would be punished by God's law, but it doesn't work. Before he can keep talking, Kadim throws the goblin's head in his direction, making him drop to the ground to avoid being hit. Seeing the demon's head, the paladin is confused. Then he looks forward again, and is startled, when he sees that enormous berserk charging toward him. The paladin manages to get up, and begins to charge his power, then rushing toward the barbarian. Covered in light, the young man braces himself and thrusts his spear into Kadim's chest. The idiot starts celebrating, thinking he's won, but Kadim remains standing, asking if that was all the rookie had. The blonde is terrified when he sees that the barbarian had caught the spear with his bicep. Without hesitation, the berserk moves in to land a punch on his enemy, hitting him square in the face and sending the idiot flying. Kadim goes over to his fallen enemy and starts pummeling him with more punches. After taking a beating for a while, the paladin begs for his life. With his face completely disfigured, he even admits he was wrong, and once again asks the barbarian to stop beating him. After seeing Kadim turn around and walk away, the blonde gives thanks, but in his head, he says that one day he'll get revenge. Feeling safe, the young man starts grumbling that he would take revenge in the name of his god. At that moment, the tip of a spear strikes the ground and starts being dragged toward the paladin by Kadim, who stops in front of his enemy. Our MC places the paladin's spear on top of his chest. Seeing this, the blonde nearly soils himself in fear, but it's no use, and Kadim tells the villain to go meet the god Elga in person. As he turns around, the MC sees the soldiers in the distance. All of them were running for their lives. So the berserk crouches down, picking up one of the spears while commenting that he learned something the first time he beat that game. At that moment, the soldiers keep running. One of them looks back, believing he's safe, until a spear pierces his skull. Right after that, all the other surviving soldiers are also quickly struck down and finished off. Kadim then states that he learned you should never leave loose ends. Behind the boy, hidden in a bush, were two surviving soldiers, trying not to make any noise. The berserk quickly notices and turns around, throwing yet another spear. It flies toward the bush, hitting both soldiers dead on and getting a double kill. One of the criminals calls out to the barbarian, saying it was badass to see him defeat that paladin. The old man tries to ask Kadim to free him, but soon has his head separated from his body. This scene leaves the other criminals shocked, and they start backing away in fear, so as not to leave any loose ends. Kadim leaps toward them. Seeing the big guy approach, one of the prisoners asks why he's doing this. The poor man even begs for his life, but he is quickly finished off. Our MC mercilessly finishes off all the prisoners. The boy tells himself that if he left the bandits alive, they would go around spreading stories. That's why he took care of all of them, to avoid the risk. Nearby, The merchant who had been unjustly imprisoned was hiding in a bush, trembling with fear, until the barbarian finds him. While staring at the skinny man, the MC thinks that this one would be the last, then raising his spear to finish the job. But the merchant shouts that this was unfair, interrupting the blow. The man begs to be spared and claims he is innocent. Kadam is unmoved and asks for a reason to let him live. Then the crybaby says he has a wife and children waiting for him at home, and that he had been imprisoned unjustly. Even seeing that this guy seemed innocent, Kadam decides to put an end to him. Before the berserk can do that, the merchant shouts, asking if he didn't need a guide. Hearing this, Kadam seems to grow thoughtful. Then, the skinny man explains that he was a traveling merchant, and therefore knew all the terrain in the region. Kadam takes advantage of this to ask whether Lucanian had always been an empire. This leaves the merchant confused, wondering if this guy was one of the barbarians from the desert lands who had lost contact with civilization. Irritated, the MC asks why the merchant is staying silent. He spills it, and explains that it had been about 248 years since the emperor established the Lucanian Empire. That was why this was the year according to the new calendar, and a confused Kadam asks what year it would be based on the old calendar. Hearing that it would be around the year 1130, the berserk is confused, since the calendar from his time was now considered old. He then decides to ask the merchant about the continent's current state, and what happened to the faith of Elga. The man begins to explain that Lucanian unified the continent 300 years ago, and now the continent was divided among 3 powers. The faith of Elga took the opportunity to expand its power, and as for the demon kingdom, no one who went there ever returned alive. This information shocks Kadim, so he decides to say the names of the companions from his old party, and ask if the merchant recognized any of them. Hearing this, the merchant grows thoughtful, stating that he recognizes the name Melissa because he had heard it somewhere before. Seeing this, the MC realizes that the heroes responsible for conquering the demon kingdom and killing the demon king had been forgotten. He then decides to ask why the demons were feeding so uncontrollably. The merchant says he doesn't know, but there were some theories, and some said it was divine punishment, while others said that a mad archmage had opened a portal to another world, and some even said it was a sign that something terrible was approaching. However, God was the only one with the answer to that. After hearing all this, Kadam is left lost, picking up the spear beside him and walking forward. The young man thinks that based on the information, this place was probably the continent from 300 years after his first attempt. Besides being cast out of his original world, he had also been cast out of his old world, and the knowledge in his head was many years out of date, and all his former companions were now nothing but memories. There was also no reason to keep living while drinking disgusting demon blood and facing madness. Besides, there was no way for him to know whether he would return to his original world when he reached the end of the game, because a new Game++ screen might appear. Because of that, Kadam makes a decision, closing his eyes and snapping the wooden spear in his hands in half. The merchant turns around, confused, seeing the barbarian in front of him point the spear at his own neck. He even tries to question why the berserk is doing this, but is ignored. Kadam thinks that if he starts this journey over, he will grow attached to even more things, and because of that it would be easier to find an end now. Gripping the spear tightly, on the verge of ending it all, he says he doesn't want to see a screen that says game over when he dies. Determined, the barbarian places the spear against his neck, until he remembers Melissa saying that after defeating the great demon, she would teach mages, or create a tower. This fills the MC with motivation. He comes back to reality, and asks whether the merchant had said he had heard the name Melissa before, and the man confirms it right after. So the skinny man says he wasn't sure, but Melissa was the name of the first master of the mage's tower. The berserk intimidates him, and asks where that tower is, so the poor guy reveals the tower's location, and adds that it would take about 2 months to get there. The MC thinks for a moment, and gives a little smile. Remembering Melissa, he complains about having said her name, since because of that he couldn't die in peace. Next, the barbarian orders the merchant to guide him along the fastest route. However, the skinny man tries to explain that he had a family to take care of, and couldn't spend that much time being a guide. Kadim places his hand on the merchant's shoulder, and comments that if the skinny man guided him, he would reward him by letting him live, then ordering the short man to take off those shackles and grab everything important, because they would be leaving soon. The MC picks up a nearby sword, deciding to keep it, even though it was a very weak low-grade weapon compared to blessed weapons, because even though he wanted to keep the paladin's spear, the weapon had been consecrated by a priest of Elga, and would reject him. So the young man laments not having the axe he used in his first attempt. After gathering everything necessary into a bag, the merchant is relieved to have at least stayed alive. When he looks to the side, he sees Kadim putting goblin blood into a leather bottle. Our MC places the bottle at his waist along with his new sword, finishing the preparations and stating that it was time to leave. Thus the duo sets out toward the mage's tower. Sometime after they had left, several crows were feeding on the bodies. A person approaches the paladin's body and calls him Linton Polypus. Behind that person was a knight, and he reports that apparently all the prisoners and soldiers were killed. Therefore, he wished to know what Miss Helia's next orders were. Helia orders Ethan to look for any clues, because there was no way they could go back and simply tell the Archbishop that Linton died. Without hesitation, Ethan accepts the order and withdraws from there. Furiosa the writer wonders who was stupid enough to kill a paladin servant of the Archbishop. Even without knowing who was responsible, she would make that person pay. Elsewhere, the light illuminated the sky, and in an improvised camp, Kadim was resting. Beside him there was another bed, but it was empty for some reason. Nearby, someone was panting from running so much. The merchant, despite being exhausted, runs as if his life depends on it, while thinking that he needed to get as far away as possible. Days before that, in a flashback, the merchant was thinking that escaping the Empire alone was already dangerous, but with a traveling companion who ate monsters and killed dozens of people with his bare hands, things got even worse. Besides being a barbarian, this guy was also difficult to deal with, because even when talking to him about various things, Kadim rarely spoke, and he didn't answer any question that wasn't necessary. Not content with being enigmatic, this barbarian seemed more like a wild beast. On one of the travel days, the merchant was exhausted seeing his traveling companion berserk far ahead. Furious, the Mick comments that the skinny guy was too slow. In his head, the skinny man thinks that the main problem was this barbarian's speed. After all, the idiot walked way too fast, and even though he was a traveling merchant known for walking quickly and never getting tired, he couldn't keep up with this guy's pace. Even when he was getting close to give directions, Kadim would move away, and when he finally caught up with the berserk, he would only say one word and move away again, watching him until he got close once more, as if he were ready to crush his head if he fell behind. Besides that, if he weren't Kadim's guide, the young man would already be dozens of kilometers away, and if he kept following this guy at that pace, he would suffer a nervous breakdown and die. That was why he needed to escape somehow. After running for a while, the merchant arrives, tired, at an open area. Even exhausted, the man celebrates, since he had already left the forest, so that barbarian would never find him. Besides, he abandoned his bag, which had all his fortune in it. However, it was impossible to go back, because he might end up waking that beast, and his life was more important. After a while, the man stops to catch his breath, while wondering how far he had run. The young man sighs in relief because he was finally free, but his peace is interrupted by a voice, and it frightens him. Turning around in disbelief, he comes face to face with his worst nightmare. Kadim asks the merchant where he was going in such a hurry, and whether he was trying to run away without even receiving his payment. Desperate, the poor man tries to deny it, but seeing that there was no way out, he bows and apologizes to the man. Afraid, the merchant begs for his life while apologizing for his mistake. Kadim crouches down and says he doesn't want to hear apologies, only to know the reason for the escape, since the merchant might try to run away again, then ordering the guide to explain himself already. Faced with this, the guide is reluctant, but he ends up coming clean and explaining that it's because of Kadim's extremely fast pace, because if he kept following the barbarian at that speed, he would collapse and die. While the merchant tells himself that he was going to die, Kadim becomes thoughtful. The berserk decides to return to the camp, and informs him that from now on he would walk more slowly. Hearing this, leaves the merchant shocked and confused. Back at the campfire was still burning. There, the mech was sitting on a rock, while the merchant was sleeping and having nightmares. Our mech was reflecting on his decisions, thinking that this fast pace of his was a habit from his first attempt, because he felt as if he were being hunted at every moment. After all, the Demon Kingdom, besides being hostile, had no food or water, and the word rest didn't exist. Because he kept drinking demon blood, madness was consuming him little by little, so he and his companions stopped sleeping and eating to speed up their pace. However, unlike the Demon Kingdom, the surrounding area wasn't dangerous and had plenty of water and food, so he could relax a little. Besides that, a reason to slow down had appeared, since the traveling merchant was a very useful guide. At that moment, the man was explaining that there were many conflicts at the border, and that was why they should pass through another area. Without thinking much, Kadim accepts the guide's suggestion, making him happy. Along the way, Armik comments to himself that he has the continent's map in his head, but a lot of time had passed, and without the merchant he would already have gotten lost. The merchant says that the paladins are powerful and easily captured heretics and demons, meaning they would only rest when they reached a city free from the Alliance. Hearing this, Kadim understands that the paladins are the reason it is so hard to find demons even with them spreading across the entire continent. And soon the demon blood in his bottle would become useless, so he needed to prepare by getting fresh blood. After a while, night falls. In the middle of the forest, the merchant and Kadim were walking, until they came across a village. The guide suggests going there to get food and a place to stay. Looking more carefully, Kadim notices that something is wrong there. Wasn't a single light on there, and even though it was dinner time, there was no guard protecting the gate. Hearing this, the merchant wonders if the village was abandoned, and Kadim decides to go there to check the situation. However, this frightens the guide. After all, the villagers might have fled because of demons. A noise can be heard from the village, and without fear, Kadim decides to go there. The barbarian, while drawing his sword, says that if there are demons there, that would be a very good thing. Fearlessly, the MC walks through the empty village. Faced with this frightening place, the merchant wonders why there is no one there, since it didn't look like an abandoned village. Kadim approaches a house with the door open and stares at it as if he were sensing something. The guide is confused, wondering why his master suddenly stopped. From the house comes a disgusting green creature trying to stab the MC, but it is quickly split in half. Seeing half of the goblin fall beside him, the poor guide screams in fear. A few more ugly goblins appear there with improvised weapons. Kadim finds this situation strange because the goblins of this world are shy and avoid humans, so for them to be aggressive, some entity had to be involved. In other words, this was the perfect place to get quality blood. The chubby goblin charges with his piece of wood, and ends up being split into 2 pieces just like his friend. Seeing their ally being finished off, leaves the other 2 goblins paralyzed. The berserker ignores them and moves in to finish that battle. Faced with this, the bald green one even tries to defend himself, but ends up having his head separated from his body. After finishing off another enemy, Kadim is forced to defend himself from a small blade which was thrown by the last living goblin. Without hesitating, our hero runs toward the monster and drives his sword through the fat one. The poor creature, upon receiving the blow, screams in pain, being finished off right afterward by Kadim. The merchant, who had been watching all this, asks if all the goblins are dead and if everything was over. However, the MC replies that he is not sure, and at that moment, one last muscular goblin comes out of the house, carrying a poor child in his arms. Upon detecting enemies, the dwarf Hulk lets out a roar. However, a sword is thrown in his direction, piercing his small head and ending his life. Before dying, the goblin even tries to make some sound, but he cannot, and ends up collapsing, dropping the little girl who was in his arms. Kadim walks toward the little girl, sitting her on a box to free her from the ropes, and saying that he has some questions to ask. Faced with this situation, the girl starts to cry and tremble. While the barbarian says he did not want to hurt her, the merchant starts acting silly to calm her down, even giving the young girl a sweet root, which she accepts, putting the food in her mouth. The merchant also tells the girl not to worry because there were no more monsters, and seeing this, Kadim praises his skill with children, so the skinny man explains that his son was around that age. The little girl calls for her mother, and this surprises the duo. They ask where that woman was, but the girl reveals that she had been abandoned by her mother and father. This leaves Kadim surprised, and the merchant realizes that was the reason the girl had been tied up like that. Then our MC understands the whole situation. At that moment, a woman appears even with the other villagers telling her to stop. The woman starts calling for her daughter Lenny, and upon finding the girl, she rushes to hug her. Finding Lenny alive, the villager begins to give thanks. On the other hand, the villagers wonder what had happened to the goblins, and whether the outsider was the one who did it. While pulling his sword from the goblin's body, Kadim states that it was his weapon that did it. And even though he already knew the truth, he wanted to hear the reason the villagers had offered children as a sacrifice to a demon. One of the men explains that the forest had many goblins, and the soil of their old land was infertile, so they set fire to it to drive away the goblins, and settle there. However, some time ago the remaining goblins began attacking the village, and the monsters were extremely fierce, constantly causing accidents and deaths. In response, the village gathered strong men to hunt down and exterminate the goblins. However, they ended up coming across a grotesque demon. The village men lost the battle to the demon and his goblins, but the monster did not kill them. Instead, the creature warned them. The following week it would go to the humans' village and wanted the most useless child from each house as a sacrifice. Hearing this makes the merchant furious, asking how those idiots had the nerve to do that to little children. The village chief replies that the village was going through hard times and they could not sacrifice the older children, but the guide does not accept that answer and remains angry. Interrupting the argument, Kadim punches the table in front of him, breaking it, and asks how many horns the demon had on its head. The confused villager replies that the creature had no horns, leaving the MC thoughtful. Picking up his sword, the barbarian tells them to show him the way. However, the villagers ask where the young man wanted to go. Our MC says it is obvious because he was going to the demon's lair. Sometime later, we see the village chief and other people guiding Kadim and the merchant. Ashamed, the man apologizes and says he has nothing to offer as payment because the village was in a terrible situation. On the other hand, the MC replies that he was doing this for his own interests and did not need payment, leaving the villager very grateful. Kadim also says that he will keep their axe because he only had one weapon. Farther ahead, the villager says they have arrived, and that cave was where the demon lived. Kadim stands still for a moment. The other villagers say they would return to the village because the goblins might attack there. This leaves the merchant irritated, asking if all those people came there just to serve as guides. The barbarian says that cowards only get in the way on the battlefield, so only the guide would go, since he needed someone to hold the torch and provide light during the fight. Even reluctantly, the merchant agrees. Then the pair enters the cave. Inside, the guide asks why his lord isn't lecturing those cowards who offered their own children to demons. Kadim asks if the young man has ever seen a demon before, and the merchant thinks he has only seen bodies on the black market, so he says no. The berserker then explains that after a human faces a demon, they are never the same again. Their noble will to live is shattered, leaving only fear and the instinct to survive, and only a few humans manage to overcome that fear. That answer still doesn't convince the merchant, after all. To him it was far too extreme to offer his son as a sacrifice. Then Kadim adds that sometimes, to survive, it was necessary to get your hands dirty, and those people had no other choice. Even after hearing all that, the merchant disagrees with that attitude. After all, doing that was almost the same as abandoning your own humanity, and there was no point in living like that. After hearing that, our MC freezes, thinking that after going through so much in order to return to his world, his perception had become completely distorted. This NPC from a game understood morality better than he did, so he didn't know if he would be able to live among humans again when he returned to his world. Seeing that strange reaction, the merchant wonders if he said something wrong, and asks Kadim whether he thinks the children are still alive. He replies that if the demon were less cunning and wicked, it would have finished off the children, but they are probably still alive. This confuses the merchant, since it should be the opposite. But out of nowhere, Kadim raises his axe, pointing it toward the merchant, frightening the man, who asks his lord to stop because of it shrinking back in fear as he sees the barbarian throw the axe. But the weapon passes by the guide going toward a dark part of the cave and hitting something. This leaves the merchant confused. Suddenly, a goblin emerges from the darkness with the axe lodged in its head. The creature is finished off and falls to the ground, but behind it was an army of those green creatures, and they charge at the MC. Seeing that, the guide gets scared, wondering where so many enemies came from, but Kadim tells the young man to keep lighting the way. Then the barbarian charges forward using his sword to skewer 2 goblins at once. The MC then grabs one more enemy by the hand and turns to cut it in half, but ends up striking his sword against something. When he sees his blade hit a rock formation, the MC realizes it would be difficult to handle his sword in that place. The goblins are confused when they see the MC tie a strip of leather around the sword's blade. As the creatures charge toward him, Kadim grabs the blade of his sword without cutting himself, because of the leather. Now wielding the sword as if it were a dagger, with a quick movement, he strikes one of the monsters in the skull. Then pressing forward and finishing off 3 more of those ugly creatures, Kadim immediately turns around and realizes he needs to recover his axe. In the blink of an eye, the young man grabs the axe's handle, pulling it from the goblin's corpse, and reclaiming the weapon. Then using it and the sword to carry out a massacre. The boy uses the axe and the sword at the same time to eliminate 2 enemies and to split one opponent's head in 2. Seeing all that, the merchant seems frightened, not understanding how a single person eliminated so many enemies. After seeing their friends being brutalized, the remaining goblins start to run. The guide warns his lord about this. Kadim then says they would follow the goblins, because having lost many members, the creatures should return to the demon. So the pair continues deeper into the cave together, and along the way the merchant comments that it was strange that the path was getting wider instead of narrower, because somehow the walls seem to have been carved out to enlarge the area, and this could be the goblin's base. But at that moment, a smell invades Kadim's nostrils. He immediately tells the merchant to be careful, because the demon was near. Besides that, the young man was not to run, because the goblins would track him down and finish him off. Before he can continue speaking, the barbarian notices something turning around immediately, and being forced to defend himself from a blow that grazes him. Thus, the demon and our MC face each other for the first time. The creature is surprised, since it didn't see Kadim last time, and he didn't look like a villager, so this was quite amusing. The barbarian immediately notices something different, because even though it was small, this demon did indeed have a horn growing. The young man realizes things have gone to hell, so he prepares for battle, coming face to face with this grotesque creature. In his head, Kadim thinks that if it had a horn growing, this monster was evolving from a lesser demon into an intermediate one. Seeing that expression of fear, the demon says it likes that, then quickly disappearing and appearing in front of Kadim, trying to attack him with its claws, but having its strike blocked. The creature then says it likes humans because, besides being weak, they were obedient. Our MC thinks he lost sight of this thing in a second, and only blocked by instinct. And just as he thought, this is not the power and speed of a lesser demon, so the young man knocks away the enemy's claws and backs off. The demon says he is irritated now because Kadim must have sent many of his goblins to F, and for that he should beg forgiveness. Our MC thinks that while a lesser demon could be defeated by 10 strong untrained men, an intermediate one could even defeat a troop of soldiers. At that moment, the creature says it would give him a chance and to earn its forgiveness and leave alive, the human had to cut off his own arm and eat it. Ignoring that, Kadim thinks that in his current state it would be difficult to fight an intermediate demon, but its horn was not fully formed, so there was a chance. Irritated, the demon asks why the barbarian had not obeyed him. Tired of hearing that, Kadim plants his sword in the ground and states that his enemy was very noisy. Besides, he did not listen to blood bags. Then the young man tears open his leather flask. Upon smelling it, the demon is startled, asking why a human was carrying that, and even drinking it. After drinking his energy boost, the MC throws the pouch. He begins to be overtaken by the power of Berserk, even screaming like a madman. Seeing this madness, the demon even starts to feel afraid. Kadim opens his eyes, taking on a terrifying stance and looking at his body. He thinks that the blood, even though old, still had an effect, though it would not last long. The creature comes back to its senses, wondering why it had felt fear of a human when it had even gained a new power. Furious, the devil declares that he will kill the MC, then charging toward him with his sharp claws. Kadim thinks that demons were cunning and fled without hesitation if they sensed danger, but this one's judgment might be being affected by the growing horn. Without hesitation, the monster uses its claws to try to scratch its enemy. With ease, the barbarian manages to use his axe to stop his enemy's blow and strike its arm. Feeling the hit, the monster freezes for a moment. Meanwhile, our MC sees that his axe had worn down just from that blow, and if he kept fighting like that, his weapon would break. But that did not matter, because he would fight no matter what. Then charging at the beast with his sword. Seeing his claws slightly broken, the devil gets angry and says that was unforgivable. Our hero, on the other hand, keeps advancing, appearing in front of the enemy with his sword and bringing it down on him in a top-down strike. Even though frightened, the demon manages to defend himself with his claws, but starts being forced downward, and that makes him realize that this human had tremendous power. While pressing the enemy down with his sword, Kadim draws the axe with his other arm. Afraid of being killed, the demon knocks away the enemy's sword and jumps back, dodging the other strike. After landing back on the ground, the creature is shocked by such destructive strength coming from a human. Even so, the idiot charges in trying to pierce the MC's head, but he dodges to the side and uses his shoulder to slam right into the fatty's belly, sending him flying away. Without giving him time to breathe, Kadim tries to use his sword to cut his enemy passing inches from his neck. Next, the MC spins and uses his axe to strike the demon. Realizing how dangerous that attack was, the devil throws himself backward, escaping by a hair. Kadim ends up hitting a stalactite, shattering it to pieces, and leaving the monster on the ground. The creature, trembling with fear, asks if the monster in front of him was really a human, making Kadim very irritated. In its head, the creature states that there was no way this guy was human, so he had to be a monster pretending to be one. With no other choice, he jumps upward, grabbing a stalactite so as not to fall. In the air, the idiot thinks he was being defeated and that his enemy could read all his movements. Suddenly, the merchant shouts for the goblins to get back and threatens all of them with the torch in his hands. After taking a good look, the demon stares directly at the torch, realizing that if the fire went out, the barbarian would be in trouble. Watching that disgusting monster move across the ceiling, Kadim spins his axe, grabbing it by the handle and preparing to throw it. In his head, the young man reveals that he already knew the opponent's plan, then telling the fatty to stop immediately. Seeing that demon's agility, the MC understands that if he threw the axe directly at it, the monster would dodge, but he already had a plan to prevent that. Next, the berserk grips the axe handle tightly, preparing to throw it, and hurling it toward the monster. Seeing the weapon coming toward him, the creature panics. The axe spins through the air until it hits the stalactite the monster was hanging from. The goblins are startled when they see that. Then the demon starts plummeting from the ceiling, hitting the ground violently and kicking up a cloud of dust. The demon survives, but starts complaining about the dust in his eyes. Seizing the chance, the MC appears in front of the monster with his sword, attacking and managing to make a little hole in the demon's head. Even with that blow, the monster does not die, and uses its hands to hold the sword. Our MC mocks his enemy, and hearing that makes the monster furious, wanting to kill him. Kadim is impressed that this monster is still alive, even with a sword piercing its head, twisting it to cause more damage. Feeling that makes the monster scream in pain, begging the MC to stop. Our hero decides to obey, then pulling the sword upward and finishing off the creature, making him lie down for an endless sleep. Before completely kicking the bucket, the monster lets out one last scream, but soon loses its life. Then the berserk buff starts leaving Kadim's body, and he feels relieved to have finished in time. After all, he was about to face an intermediate monster without any stat boost. Upon hearing some grunts, the meek snaps back to reality and sees the goblins completely terrified. He realizes the creatures were no longer as ferocious because with the demon's death, the monsters were no longer being affected by demonic energy. Even so, the young man turns his sword and uses it to sever the head of one of the living goblins. In his mind, the man thinks that these beasts were once monsters, and because of that he needed to kill them before leaving. Seeing his companion finished off, the second goblin panics and tries to run away from there. However, the little monster ends up with a sword piercing through its face. The Mick remains cold in this situation, looking to the side and noticing one more goblin holding a torch, then moving in to finish it off. Kadim makes a move to kill the creature, but at that moment, the merchant tells his lord to stop, snapping him out of the trance he was in. The barbarian manages to stop his movement by a hair, before doing something stupid. When he opens his eyes, the merchant realizes he had almost died. Our Mick, on the other hand, was in shock but is quickly snapped out of it by the guide calling him. Kadim turns around saying it was dark and he couldn't see properly. so that's why he did it. Besides that, the children were deeper inside the cave, so they should take care of the remaining goblins and bring them back to the village. And the merchant agrees. So the two head into the cave with Kadim carrying the demon's body. Sometime later in the village, the villagers were in disbelief at seeing their children alive. They all thank the mercenary, and one woman even offers him a chicken stew. However, Kadim asks the woman to give the stew to the children who returned. After all, they were hungry and sleepy. Besides that, the merchant was the one who should eat the stew, and he would rest in the meantime. Before leaving, the merchant turns back seeing the completely shocked face of one of the children, and becomes thoughtful. In a flashback, the guide was completely terrified upon seeing all the children completely out of their minds. The Emmy explains that they must have been brainwashed ever since they were captured. The monsters forced the children to repeat things until their minds broke. Like your parents abandoned you. You are the most useless child in the world, and those things were repeated so many times that not even an adult could endure it. On top of that, there was a bit of truth to it, since these children had been abandoned by their own parents. After being abandoned by the people they loved most, these children will never be able to grow up normally again. The merchant is incredulous, asking how a demon could do that, and Kadim states that this is the nature of those creatures, because human suffering and despair were their food, and hearing that, leaves the guide in shock. The guide understands. That was the reason Kadim had said that if the monster weren't so wicked, it would have finished off the children. Even so, the young man says he still has hope, because if the parents took care of the children, they might return to normal. The barbarian says it's possible, but unlikely. After all, if the parents were able to abandon the children, they would hardly be able to give them love. Back in reality, the merchant was a little sad. Even reluctantly, he turns around and heads to the village together with Kadim. There, the young man is surprised that Kadim already wants to leave, asking why he wouldn't rest and travel only the next day. The barbarian reveals that someone had probably already found the bodies, and killing a paladin was an unforgivable crime. The merchant thinks he had completely forgotten about that. After all, the barbarian had finished off one of the paladins of the Holy Empire of Elga. Kadim also warns that if they were unlucky, they could already be being tracked, and because of that they should leave. Back to where the paladin's body was, Hylia seemed thoughtful. In the village, the mech uses his dagger on the demon body's neck, drawing blood and using it to fill his leather flask. The mech laments that he only managed to fill half the flask, because that way he could only use it in an emergency. But in the end, passing through this village was very useful. Seeing the mercenary let the demon's body drop, one of the villagers asks if he had any plans for that carcass. Kadam says no and asks the villager to burn the body. That leaves the man confused. After all, this guy went through all the trouble of getting that carcass, but that didn't matter, because if Kadam wasn't going to use it, he would find a way to profit from that demon. The barbarian warns that if the body wasn't burned, the smell of blood would spread, and when another creature fed on the demon, it would become a demon. So the mech asks if the villager wanted to be attacked by goblins again, and he promptly says no, then dragging the body away to burn it. Suddenly an old woman calls the mercenary, and says that as thanks, the villagers gathered some useful items for him. Kadim simply thanks her and says he will make good use of them, then putting on his new boot and tightening his new belt, well realizing it really was useful. Before leaving, something happens to the wound on Kadim's chest caused by the paladin, leaving Berserk confused. He thinks that this body had an absurd regenerative capacity, and even though it had healed from the wound caused by the demon, the one from the paladin still hadn't disappeared, and the blame must lie with that blessed weapon. Back to where the paladin's body was, Edan calls out to Helia and reports that he searched the surrounding area but found no clues, which leaves the young woman angry. Helia tells the soldier to look carefully and deduce the culprit's intentions. After all, they killed all the prisoners, so the goal wasn't to tear them apart. Besides that, the soldiers' weapons were not stolen, and the demon's body was also mutilated. Aiden asks if his commander had any idea who did this, or which heretical group was responsible for this mess. However, Heya gets even more irritated, and says she only told him that so he could find clues based on deduction, even going so far as to humiliate the poor soldier. Annoyed, Aiden thinks that not even Heya knew who the culprit was, but given who she was, there was no arguing with her. After all, Muviel was an arch-paladin who rose to her position after single-handedly defeating 20 demons. Being the youngest arch-paladin, and even with a bad personality, she was someone skilled. Even frustrated, the soldier understands the reality of the situation, and decides not to mess with the young woman. Tired of waiting, the paladin orders Eden to bring the sacred relic that had been given by Bishop Arensko. Realizing she means Damien's twin mirrors, Eden asks her to reconsider, since it hadn't even been 10 years since one of the mirrors broke. This sacred relic was a pair of mirrors that could reflect scenes from the future and the past, but the one that showed the future was shattered, after reflecting a very powerful being. Helia gets irritated and states that she will not break the mirror. Besides, there was no way she could return empty-handed to the Archbishop, since the dead paladin was his nephew, then telling Edon to stop worrying, since the mirror would only break if it reflected a great demon. The man gives in and hands over the relic. The paladin positions herself with the mirror pointing it toward the bodies and reflecting a strong light. The two then manage to see Kadim drinking demon blood, and right after that finishing off the paladin with the sacred weapon. Edon is shocked by all of this. At that moment, the mirror reflects the image of Kadim transformed, after drinking the blood shattering right afterward. Seeing the relic break apart, Edon along with Helia are left in shock. The soldier states that the mirror could only be broken if it reflected something very powerful, so this barbarian was an entity on the level of a great demon. Faced with this, the man remains in shock, then asks Helia to return to the holy capital to report this to the archbishop. The paladin states that this was not necessary, since the culprit had already been revealed, so they would continue the investigation. Next, the young woman places her hand on the hilt of her sword, drawing the weapon, and stating that she would eliminate this demon in human skin with her own hands. At night, far from there, the merchant was filling his bottle with water from the lake. The poor man couldn't forget the situation of those poor children from the village. Then the young man decides to forget about it, to focus on surviving and returning safely to his family, because if he wanted to please the barbarian, he couldn't be in this state. After walking a bit, the young man returns to where the camp was, and asks if his lord had been waiting long. However, when he looks closely, the merchant realizes that Kadim was in terrible condition. Confused, the merchant wonders how someone capable of killing a demon ended up like this out of nowhere, until he notices something strange about the wound on the barbarian's chest. The panting berserk gets irritated for not realizing it sooner. After all, that blessed weapon had a blessing capable of inflicting fatal wounds on demons. Naturally, this shouldn't affect a human, but he was a barbarian who gained power through demonic blood. The merchant scolds Kadim because they should have stayed resting in the village. However, the berserk replies that this wound would not heal with rest, and besides, he wanted to know what the moon was like tonight. Upon hearing that it was waning, the mech seems relieved, because he would still have time to do something. However, this peace is interrupted by some howls. After the sound, the merchant and the mech look behind them and come face to face with several frightening eyes coming from the forest. Suddenly a paw steps onto the ground, and from the darkness a fierce wolf reveals itself. Even in a deplorable state, Kadim arms himself by grabbing his axe and his sword. Then, the man tells the merchant to stay behind him. In his head, the berserk curses this world that would not leave him in peace. Even in the face of a pack of wolves, the berserk does not retreat, taking a fighting stance and ready for a brawl. The pack of wolves gets closer and closer. Completely exhausted, the mech faces these monsters taking a fighting stance even while at a disadvantage. One of the wolves lunges to attack. Kadim throws his axe, hitting the wolf in the shoulder and sending the monster flying away. The barbarian realizes his vision is blurry because he had aimed between the creature's eyes but missed. The rest of the pack is not intimidated and starts running toward the mech. Without hesitation, the mech grips his sword, using it to impale and finish off another wolf. Then the young man severs another monster's head but ends up getting bitten on the arm. Furious, he clenches his fist and punches the wolf that bit him in the snout, turning around right after and landing another punch on one of the other monsters. At that moment, one of the wolves bites Kadim's leg, making the young man cry out in pain and use his sword to impale the monster that did it. Seeing their allies being killed, the remaining wolves seem to back off. Armik thinks that if his body weren't in this condition, he would have already finished this. Then he hears the merchant telling the wolves not to come any closer, and when he looks, he sees that he is surrounded by monsters. Even knowing that drinking this would be almost like swallowing poison, Kadim opens his bottle, releasing the smell of blood which is sensed by all the nearby wolves. The young man begins to drink the demonic life fluid, then drops his bottle and begins to give off a terrifying aura. The pack seems intimidated. With his red eyes, the mech stares down the monsters and pulls out his sword that was stuck in one of the wolves. The wolves surrounding the merchant look back and are quickly finished off by the berserk. Seeing this, the merchant is shocked. Next, Kadim retrieves his axe and uses both his weapons to take down a few more monsters. He explains that the blood berserk buff changes depending on the blood consumed. This time, the effect should be speed, and after saying that, Kadim sees some wolves coming toward him. He quickly dodges the attack and manages to strike back at the monsters. After that, the young man thinks that demon was very fast, and that was why its blood had that effect. The wolves begin to retreat for some reason. The confused merchant wonders why those monsters are running away, but Kadim understands the situation. At that moment, a white paw steps in front of the mech, and an alpha wolf emerges from the forest. Seeing this leaves the merchant frightened, commenting that this monster was twice the size of the others. Kadim realizes he's in trouble because not only had the leader of the pack appeared, but his buff was also about to run out. Without giving the enemy time to think, the wolf charges and throws itself at the human. The barbarian barely manages to dodge backward, but ends up feeling a heavy impact and drops his weapons from the pain. Unable to stay on his feet, Kadim drops to his knees. Seeing this, the guide panics, asking if his lord was alright, and telling him to pull himself together because the wolf was heading toward them. The scar on Kadim's chest causes immense pain. Meanwhile, the white wolf keeps getting closer and closer to its prey. Armik looks up at the sky, wondering if the conditions still hadn't been met, and ends up seeing something shocking. He realizes everything is ready, because it is midnight and the moon has completely disappeared. So the young man drives his sword into the ground, beginning to pray, asking the undefeated master of 10,000 soldiers to place his hands upon that blade, and to bless this warrior who thirsted for battle, and wished to sate himself with the blood of his enemies. Kadam concludes the ritual by reciting a few words. Then a glow begins to emanate from the blade, leaving the white wolf and the merchant confused. An aura envelops the Mick's entire body, and from it a voice asks what name Kadam would give that sword. Our Mick thinks it has been a long time since the last time he heard that voice of the will on his first attempt. Next, the berserk decides to name his weapon Mosquito. The aura passes into the sword, and at the beginning of the blade a mysterious symbol is engraved. Thus, Kadam finishes using his unique trait, called the One Who Grants Names. Suddenly, the alpha wolf lunges to attack. This frightens the merchant. Now with his new weapon, the mech uses it to make a clean cut on the wolf, which howls in pain. Then the special effect vampirism is activated, and the sword drains a bit of vitality. Thus, a small amount of Kadam's life is restored, and his wounds are healed. Seeing this, the monster howls in rage. Realizing it is not enough to heal completely, the berserk decides to go for another round. Sometime later, we see the mech gently drive his sword through the wolf's head. The weapon begins to drain vitality, passing it on to the young man. Another amount of life is restored. Then the wound caused by the blessed weapon is completely healed. After massacring the entire pack, Kadam states that it was actually a good thing those mutts showed up. Next, he realizes that the symbol engraved on his sword must mean mosquito, and vampirism was a special effect capable of restoring life force after dealing damage to an enemy. However, that weapon's rank was low, so the skill's efficiency was not great, and that was why he only fully recovered after defeating many enemies. Even so, the young man is satisfied because that was enough for now. Besides, he thinks that this effect could be replicated, and that he could thus obtain a new weapon with another special effect. Wanting too much at the beginning would only get in his way, and that was a lesson he learned on his first attempt, so he would relax a little. From behind a tree, the merchant reveals himself, asking if it was all over. The guide walks among the bodies and wonders if the barbarian was alive. Upon finding Kadam, the merchant is confused to see that the young man has recovered from all his injuries. Ignoring that, Kadam asks why he did not run away. After all, if the merchant had fled while he was wounded and fighting, he would have managed to escape. Hearing this, the merchant becomes thoughtful, until he realizes he may have missed a golden opportunity. But the mix sighs and simply says that even if the guide had really run away, he would still have been able to catch up to him and capture him. Thoughtful, the skinny man wonders why he did not run away, and whether he was really worried about this crazy barbarian. Kadame tells the merchant to stand guard, because he was exhausted and was going to rest, also warning that if the skinny man tried to run away, it would be useless, since he could find him anywhere in the world, and would give him a painful death. Hearing that, the man nearly shits himself in fear, and with no other choice, ends up staying awake all night guarding the camp. The next day, the merchant was studying the map. He tells Kadame they would have to travel for 10 more days to reach the Alliance's territory, since they were taking a longer route to avoid the region occupied by the Empire. Our MC asks if they would have problems at the border, since he didn't want to run into another paladin. The merchant tells his master not to worry. After all, that was the reason they had come through a less guarded region, and at worst they would only run into a few bandits, who of course would be no problem for the barbarian. Besides that, there was a small castle called Multana, untouched by the faith of Elga, where they could restock their supplies. Then the merchant begins to explain in detail the route they would take. Kadim thinks the merchant really was telling the truth, and even though it would be a long and difficult journey, it was still much better than before, because for more than 300 years the eastern part of the continent had been locked in a fierce power struggle, so people naturally became closed off and hated outsiders, especially a giant barbarian. Even Melissa looked at him like he was an insect, and he understood that, after all, out of nowhere a barbarian had asked to travel with a mage who had spent her life shut away, studying. After seeing the berserk for the first time, Melissa wrote several bad things about him in her diary. Back in the present, the young man smiles as he remembers that. The merchant tells his lord not to worry, because the Alliance's free cities were a free place where he could walk around without trouble. Out of nowhere, the two hear some people arguing nearby. Up ahead on the road, some kind of commotion was happening. Kadim asks the merchant what that scene looked like to him. Looking over the scene, the merchant says that some people were scolding a few bandits. Wanting to avoid unnecessary trouble, the berserk decides to take another path. However, one of the bandits spots the barbarian and calls out to him for some reason. Kadim turns around, annoyed. Seeing the bandits approaching, the berserk draws his sword along with his axe, getting ready for battle. The MC stays ready, just waiting for the bandits to come closer. Just as they were about to approach, the bandits make some kind of hand gesture. Pointing at the berserker, one of them says he told them that guy would show up. The men who had been scolding them start to run away, and the bandits mock them for it. All the criminals, seeing that things worked out for them, start laughing non-stop. Furious, Kadim asks what the hell was going on. The blonde bandit thanks Agon's furious horn for coming there to help them. Our MC then denies being that person, and says he has neither the time nor the intention to help anyone, since he still had a long road ahead. Hearing that this guy wasn't Agon's furious horn, the bandits get confused. The blonde tries to process that information. Making a serious mistake, the idiot pulls out a knife and asks who the fuck Kadim was, and why he had shown up there to confuse them. Seeing that reaction, Kadim's expression darkens, and the merchant gets scared. The blonde bandit complains that the barbarian confused them, and keeps trying to intimidate him with a bread knife. In his head, the MC wonders if this idiot really thought he had the advantage, just because they outnumbered him. The bald man with a scar on his forehead notices the guide and his huge bag. He then steps forward, saying he wanted to check if there was anything valuable in it, but ends up hitting his head against a wall and stumbling back. After looking up, the idiot realizes he had slammed into the barbarian's chest. Clueless about the danger, the bald man says Kadim should pay for the confusion he caused, and if he didn't want to hand over some cash, then he should go with them and help in the fight, while pretending to be Agon's furious horn. The idiot starts pretending to be Agon's furious horn and tells Kadim to act exactly like that. Finally, the bald man says this whole mess was the barbarian's fault, and a man should take responsibility for his actions, unless he was a little girl. Since it was his first time seeing a barbarian, he couldn't tell him apart from a woman, and hearing that, the other bandits start laughing. Seeing his boss so quiet, the merchant realizes things were about to go to hell. After finishing his jokes, the bald man pats the berserk's bicep and decides to introduce himself by asking his name. Kadim says he would be honored to tell him, and with his sword he separates the idiot bald man's head from his body. The bald head rolls across the ground to the bandit's feet. The blonde, who had been so full of himself, upon seeing that starts screaming in desperation. While the idiots scream in fear, the guide remains calm, since he had already expected this ending. Even after seeing that, the imbeciles still have the audacity to threaten Kadim. Wielding his sword, the MC says his name, and adds that he was the great warrior of Atala. A butterfly lands on the handle of an axe, but it has to fly away in fright, because someone grabbed the weapon. After finishing off his last enemy, Kadim pulls the axe lodged in his little head free. Examining the weapon, he realizes it was in bad shape, but that was inevitable, since, besides not being made for combat, the weapon had been used constantly. As he tucks the weapon into his belt, the barbarian decides he would look for a better axe at the castle. The blonde bandit was still alive for some reason, and trembling with fear. He can't believe all his friends are fucking dead. After thinking about the axe, the MC turns around staring at the bandit, and in fear the idiot starts running. During his escape, the idiot trips smashing face first into the ground. Without mercy, our MC stretches out his leg and starts stomping on the bandit's back to torture him, while ordering the idiot to answer every question. The first was whether they were bandits, what their connection was to the guys who ran away, and who this furious horn of Agon was. Even so, the bandit still remains reluctant. The guide then explains that Agon was a city in the center of the Alliance of Free Cities because it had the largest arena on the continent. Many mercenaries and gladiators gathered there seeking wealth, and the furious horn of Agon was a barbarian mercenary who had won the competition 3 times. Kadim realizes he had been mistaken for that guy. The merchant says he finds the situation strange because that guy was a famous figure and hard to find, so even if he were paid, he would hardly go to a place like this. At that moment, the idiot on the ground denies it, saying his boss was from the arena and claimed to be the furious horn's best friend, so if they needed help the barbarian would come there. When the barbarian arrived, the merchant and Kadim would be screwed, and without mercy the MC stomps harder on his back. The blonde explains that this area used to belong to them, the Blood Cave gang, but one day the Black Hammer gang arrived and took over, so his boss called his friend. Kadim tells him the truth. The idiot had been completely fooled. The guide adds that if his boss were really friends with the furious horn, he wouldn't be some low-level bandit in a place like this. Hearing that, the blonde seems to open his eyes and feel hurt when he realizes his master lied. In his head, our MC thinks he had already finished off many members of this gang and would not be forgiven, so he would strike first to avoid ambushes. Determined to finish this, Kadim orders the bandit to reveal where their hideout was. The man even tries to deny it, but when his back is pressed down once again he agrees to take the MC there if he stops doing that. At the entrance to the Blood Cave gang's hideout, some soldiers were standing guard. Inside the cave, sitting in an armchair was the gang boss, Graham. Looking like a schizophrenic, he talks to himself, saying he was almost like a brother to the furious horn of Agon. On top of that, he had made a name for himself in Agon's famous arena and was a proud gladiator. Dropping the lies, the idiot admits he doesn't know the furious horn and was actually just a mediocre retired gladiator, with 1 win and 4 losses. He reveals that he lied about calling his so-called friend, and even if he had called, someone like the furious horn would never show up. Graham wonders where everything went wrong, because he only wanted to live simply with those idiotic yet loyal subordinates who believed his lies, but all of that ended because of those bastards from the Black Hammer gang. Graham says that if the furious horn of Agon helped him, everything would work out, and suddenly one of his subordinates arrives saying he was there. The idiot runs desperately toward his boss, even going so far as to beg for help. Graham is confused until he sees his subordinate take an axe blow to the back of the neck, and a barbarian appear behind him. As the bandit looks carefully, he notices the barbarian outfit, and this guy's incredible physique. Graham can't believe that the furious horn of Agon was really there. After retrieving his axe, Kadem points his sword at Graham and asks if the idiot was the boss there. The man remains silent and in shock. Once again, Kadem asks if Graham was the boss there, even beginning to give off an aura to intimidate him. Graham, on the other hand, thinks he had already seen the furious horn's face, and this guy wasn't him, so he wanted to know why another barbarian was attacking. Besides that, if this guy had already made it there, all his subordinates must be in heaven. In other words, even if he wasn't the furious horn of Agon, this guy was trouble. The man slams his hand against the table and decides to make the first move, charging toward the enemy. Seeing this guy coming without any weapon, Kadim is impressed and takes up his fighting stance. Graham's eyes are filled with a gleam, leaving the MC startled, but shamelessly, the retiree kneels down and asks Bro to spare his life. Graham says he has money and valuable things in the chest, so Bro could take that for now, but Kadim tells him not to call him that. Seeing this guy beg for his own life, the guide remembers when he did the same thing. The gang boss asks why the barbarian is raising his sword up there. Afraid, he raises his hands and even suggests paying a fee every time Kadim passes through there. Realizing that the barbarian wasn't listening, the man grows desperate because he didn't want to die like this. Looking up, the idiot manages to see the enemy's worn axe. As a last resort, Graham offers a treasure map that showed the location of a throwing axe made by a dwarf. Hearing that, the MC stops his attack and asks if he was serious. Graham agrees and explains that it was an axe made with the heart and soul of a dwarf craftsman. Kadim then asks the guy to tell him more about it. In his head, the retiree realizes he had caught his interest, and that was obvious because a weapon made by a dwarf was very rare, so he starts saying he had heard that the blade of this axe always stayed sharp no matter how much it was used, and when thrown, it flew like a bird. Kadim thinks that tools made by dwarves not only had great stats but also special effects and were on par with blessed weapons. However, getting something made by a dwarf is difficult, and just like in fantasy games, various races such as elves and dwarves existed in that world. However, they are minorities, and even though it was possible to obtain those tools through quests in the game, now that it was real life, it wasn't easy, because dwarves usually hate humans. In other words, if that guy was telling the truth, he couldn't miss this opportunity, because strong weapons were useful and made him depend less on demonic blood. So, Kadim asks where the map is. Graham, acting sly, promises to hand over the map, but only if Kadim spares him. Laughing, our MC doesn't believe a bandit really thought he was capable of negotiating with him. The barbarian uses his sword to give Graham a little poke, making the man groan in pain. The madman says he would make several holes in the bandit until he left him like a sieve if he didn't reveal the axe's location right away. Hearing that and feeling immense pain, Graham can't even say anything. At the Black Hammer Gang's hideout, the subordinates are trying to explain something to their boss, but they start arguing among themselves. Furious, the man slams his huge hammer into the ground. The bald guy with the giant head then asks if they were really saying that Agon's furious horn had gone there to help the Cave Blood Gang. The men then confirm it. Kreven asks if they really think that makes sense. The two beg their boss to believe them, and even tell him they saw a huge barbarian. Megamind realizes those idiots must be telling the truth, and there were also rumors about Graham being close to the furious horn, but it still didn't make sense for the arena's legendary champion to come there just to help some little bandit, so Graham must have hired just some random mercenary. However, there was still a small possibility that it really was the furious horn. Suddenly, a subordinate arrives warning that the Cave Blood Gang was approaching to invade the place. The bald man asks how many people there were. Then the bowl cut says there were two, the leader Graham and someone who seemed to be Agon's furious horn, a huge barbarian. The other two inside the room panic when they hear that. Kreven still refuses to believe it, but thinks that if it were true, they wouldn't stand a chance in a direct confrontation. As he gets up, the boss orders some men with crossbows to stay behind the barricade, and the rest to wait in the bushes and fire on his signal. The man throws his hammer over his shoulder, deciding to personally go check the situation and see if that guy really was Agon's furious horn. Walking through the forest, Graham warns that they were close to the target, then asks why Kadim wanted to go there. The MC replies that he was going there because that was where the map was, unless the guy was lying. Graham says he is telling the truth because that territory was theirs, but his gang ended up losing it to the Black Hammer Gang, and his doubt only came up because going head-on against a huge gang of bandits wasn't something common. Kadim asks how many bandits there were, and hears in response that there were around 100. The MC acknowledges that it really was a lot of people for a frontier gang, and seeing that, Graham asks to retreat. However, the Berserker only laments it, because he would get tired after finishing off so many people. so he would just get it over with. Hearing that leaves Graham shocked by this guy's madness. So the pair walk a little farther and come face to face with Kreven, who was just waiting for them. Thus, the big bald guy and Kadim stare at each other for a moment. Kreven shouts that he didn't expect to see Graham like that, and wanted to know why he was there. Even in that situation, Graham lies, claiming he was there to declare the fall of the Black Hammer gang together with his friend, the champion of the Great Arena, the Great Agon's Furious Horn. This leaves Kreven and his subordinates frightened. Graham thinks his plan worked, because that way these guys would be scared and all the attention would go to that barbarian, so he would flee during the fight. However, Kadim squeezes the idiot's head hard, lifting him off the ground. Then he shouts that he was not that so-called Furious Horn, and had no intention of fighting, because he only wanted to get an item there. If they let him get that item, a massacre would be avoided. Upon confirming his theory, Kreven celebrates. In his head, the bald man thinks that this barbarian must have been hired by Graham, but betrayed him when he saw where he would have to fight. However, the situation was strange, because even if he wasn't the Furious Horn, this barbarian was very calm. Kreven strikes his hammer against the ground. Then some soldiers point crossbows at the enemy, and others reveal themselves from the bushes. Everyone surrounding Kadim reveals themselves as they begin to laugh. After showing his power, Kreven states that to cooperate, he first needed to know what item it was. Kadim then replies that it was a map. Hearing that, the bald man remembers something and shows a map, then asks if the barbarian wanted this. Graham confirms that this was the item, and asks how Kreven had it. The big-headed man replies that he found it easily under a rock. Besides that, many groups came there looking for it, and at the X marked on the map there should be something valuable. So then he asks if Kadim really wanted this. The barbarian is then startled when he sees the idiot in front of him, tearing the map in half. Not even Graham understands why this guy is doing that. After tearing the map, Kreven swallows it, and then tells Kadim to try to get the item, while patting his own belly. The berserker says that if the idiot insisted so much, he would grant his wish, but he was going to do it quickly, before his stomach digested the map. Kreven immediately orders his men to fire. So, from atop the tower, the crossbows begin shooting. Kadim, realizing this, grabs Graham by the shoulder, and lifts him up in front of himself. All the arrows begin to rain from the sky, hitting the poor liar. Not even Big Head can believe this. Pierced like a sieve, Graham groans in pain. Kreven wonders how this lunatic betrayed the one who hired him without a shred of remorse. Then the idiot orders the shooters to aim for the visible parts, since Kadim couldn't cover his whole body. At that moment, the idiots begin reloading their crossbows. Suddenly, an axe is thrown heading toward one of the shooters, striking his head and finishing him off. The poor man then falls backward, already lifeless. Kadim, on the other hand, remains calm. The shooters immediately duck down, still in shock after seeing their friend get finished off. Meanwhile, the barbarian keeps using Graham as a shield against the arrows. One of the arrows pierces the liar's hand, causing immense pain, and tired of this, he tells Kadim to finish him off already. Kreven curses at his soldiers and tells them to fire together, or they'd never hit him. Then the bald man orders the rest of his men to charge at the berserk. After the command, an army advances toward Kadim. Our MC then throws Graham toward the enemies, stopping some of them from moving forward. Kadim thinks there were too many enemies, and his weapon could even heal his wounds, but dealing with so many people could be dangerous. So, after drinking the demonic blood, Kadim decides to end this quickly. Kreven is confused, wondering what the hell that idiot had drunk. The MC, on the other hand, begins to feel an intense power, because the last time he drank that blood his body was wrecked, so he draws his sword, stomps hard on the ground, and prepares to attack. While the bandits were worried about Graham's body, Kadim disappears. The idiots wonder where the barbarian was, and without even realizing it, they have their heads separated from their bodies. The other soldiers, seeing this, fall into despair. Once again, Kadim stomps on the ground, gaining momentum to charge forward, and taking out a whole bunch more enemies. One of the survivors wonders why this idiot is so fast. However, with a swift movement of the sword, he too has his head separated. Along with him, 2 more extras are sent to a better place. Seeing this massacre happening to his soldiers, Kreven understands nothing. In disbelief, the man tries to understand what is happening. After all, it shouldn't be possible for a barbarian to receive Elga's power, and this guy actually looked like a monster. Even afraid, the bald man gulps nervously, then asks one of his men to bring him a crossbow. With the weapon in hand, Kreven waits for the right moment. In his head, the idiot thinks that even if Kadim was fast, there was still a way to stop him, and sooner or later he would slip up. When the barbarian was attacking, Kreven notices an opening because he turned his back to find the next target. At the right moment, the bald man fires, then the bolt heads toward Kadim, catching him by surprise, and drawing close to his face. Kreven then celebrates, saying he got his target. When the bolt was about to hit its target, the bald man notices something that frightens him. Kadim had managed to catch the bolt with his hands. Then the MC breaks the tip of the projectile. Kreven, on the other hand, doesn't understand how that bastard caught a bolt with his bare hands. Our MC takes a step and starts walking toward the enemy. Noticing this, Baldy orders the other crossbows to fire. The idiot bandits move in to attack in order to protect their boss. But with clean, swift movements of his sword, Kadim finishes off most of them. After doing that, the boy stares at his target. Kreven and his subordinate tremble in fear at the sight of this demon walking toward them. The boss then asks how many crossbows were loaded, and upon hearing the answer, starts coming up with a plan with his subordinates. Big Head puts a bolt in his pocket, then grabs the handle of his hammer and raises it. Kadim keeps walking and eliminating enemies along the way. Kreven thinks to himself that his subordinates could no longer block this monster's path, and even if he used his hammer, he wouldn't be a match. Then, looking down and seeing a crossbow, the guy gets an idea. Meanwhile, the berserk approaches the bald man and starts throwing hands. Big Head moves to attack with his hammer, striking the ground in front of Kadim, and throwing several pieces of debris into his eye. Then Kreven orders his subordinates to attack, so two idiots fire their crossbows. Seeing this guy using dirty tricks, the barbarian gets irritated. Kreven takes the opportunity to grab the crossbow on the ground and the bolt inside his pocket. Meanwhile, Kadim was grabbing the bolts that had been fired at him. Taking advantage of this distraction, the bald man appears beneath the MC, using his crossbow to fire right at his face. Celebrating victory, Kreven states that there was no way Kadim could catch a shot like that at point-blank range. Kadim lowers his head but shows that he is still alive. Seeing this leaves Baldy terrified. In the blink of an eye, Kadim rushes forward and makes 2 cuts on Kreven's legs, leaving him shocked. After the attack, the fat man falls to his knees on the ground, groaning in pain. As he turns around, Kreven wonders how this guy was still alive, since the bolt had clearly hit him. Kadim then bites the tip of the projectile, breaking it. The gang leader can't believe this guy caught an arrow with his teeth at point-blank range. The berserker, on the other hand, tells Kreven to wait while he finishes off the rest of the men. The bald man on his knees can only hear all his subordinates screaming and begging for help. After finishing everything, Kadim drives his sword into the ground standing in front of his enemy. Kreven says he knows it's late for that, but he wants to know if Kadim could spare him. Our MC says he has no intention of killing the fat guy, and would only rip out his stomach to recover the map. The big-headed man asks the barbarian to wait because that wouldn't be necessary, since he memorized the entire map. So the idiot starts explaining that Kadim would find the treasure in a hole beneath a fist-shaped rock, in the center of Molden Castle. Confused, the MC asks why Kreven didn't go get the treasure himself. The bald man then replies that normally his subordinates would handle that, but the castle was surrounded by hundreds of soldiers. Kadim then replies that he doesn't care about the details, and asks which troops were around the castle and why they were there. Kreven explains that Viscount Adlin's army was there to execute the demon baron, but there was more to it than that, because if a lord really made a contract with a demon, Elga's paladins would intervene. And hearing that, Kadim laments, since, unlike what he expected, things were getting more and more complicated. The MC then gets ready and says he was going to take the map to see if the bald man was lying, leaving the man desperate as he asks why. The MC then replies that he doesn't trust bandits, and as he said before, if he wanted to get the map, he would get it. Sometime later, a campfire was lit. Kadim throws down the pieces of the blood-stained map and tells the merchant to solve this puzzle. The confused guide asks where the map was to end up in that state, and when he hears it was in a stomach, he panics. The berserker then explains the situation, leaving the merchant dumbfounded. After putting the map together, the merchant asks if it matched the story told by the bandit. Then he states that the story about the castle didn't seem like a lie. Kadim falls silent for a moment, thinking about the demon baron. Far from there, in the village saved by the MC, an old woman was trembling with fear, while someone swore that no one had passed through that village recently. The man keeps lying, saying there hadn't been any incidents around there these past few days. We then see that the young man was saying this to Helia Muviel, the paladin. The woman then asks if the young man could swear by Elga that he was telling the truth. Even so, the man doesn't hesitate and swears by Elga. Muviel, seeing the woman beside him trembling, asks if she could also swear by Elga. In a flashback, Kadim says that if someone came there asking about him, the villagers were to lie, because if anyone came there and they handed him over, one day he would return to the village and kill every resident, without exception. After remembering that, the old woman also swears by Elga. Helia still finds it strange and comments that it doesn't make sense, since many clues indicated the target went there, then asks once more if no one had passed through. The blonde old woman denies it once again, swearing by Elga, and says that no mercenary passed through this village. But the paladin catches her slip, because at no point did she say the target was a mercenary. Realizing she screwed up, the old woman panics. Seeing this, Helia looks at her with contempt, and prepares to draw her sword. But before she can do anything, she hears a scream coming from a nearby house. Immediately, the little old blonde woman asks the holy knight to ignore it, because it was nothing. Hearing that, Helia grows suspicious. Upon entering the house, the woman is shocked. Right away, the young woman realizes that this boy was possessed by a powerful demon, but his mother tries to deny it, saying it's just an illness. Muviel ignores this and starts walking toward the boy. Seeing this, the old woman throws herself down and grabs the paladin's legs, begging her to stop. On the other hand, the blonde raises her hand and begins to recite some sacred words, casting a spell on the possessed boy, and making his face shine with a golden light. This light begins to illuminate the whole house. As they watch this, the villagers are confused. After the glow fades, the previously possessed boy seems to return to normal. Helia then explains that the boy was saved from an inner demon implanted by the devil, and his mother runs to hold the boy in her arms. The paladin continues and says that from now on, the souls of the children there would never again suffer from demonic whispers. The old woman then turns and profusely thanks the paladin, but without mercy, Helia strikes with her sword, severing the poor boy's head, and then saying that a lamb once stained by evil could not be kept alive. Seeing her son being killed, the old woman is left in shock, beginning to scream and cry desperately. Muvila tells the woman not to worry, because her son died without the demon, so he would enjoy eternal rest beside Elga. However, the heretic who defied the truth in Elga's name would not, so she places her sword near the old woman's neck. Then the cruel woman states that if the villager did not wish to wander eternally through darkness, she had to confess immediately where that evil spirit in the form of a barbarian had gone. Back to our MC, he was at the camp with the merchant. The guide says that thanks to the destruction of the two gangs, they had managed to secure enough supplies for quite a while. However, he was unable to find a quality weapon, just as his lord had requested. Kadim then asks if the young man knew anything about the Lord of Molden. The merchant replies that he had heard of the much talked about Demon Baron, but that nickname probably had nothing to do with a demonic contract, because once he had a drink with a merchant from Molden, and the man missed his home dearly, so it made no sense for a demonic lord to take such good care of his realm. Kadim, on the other hand, thinks that proved nothing, since many demons offered abundance and then took it away in an instant, condemning their victims to hell. In any case, the only way to get the weapon made by a dwarf was to check personally. However, getting past hundreds of soldiers with a gulp of demonic blood and a single sword would be very difficult. The guide interrupts Kadim's thoughts, asking permission to ask a question. The man explains that during the encounter with the bandits, Kadim had called himself the Great Warrior of Attila, and because of that he wanted to know who earned that title. After all, Agon's Furious Horn was also called the Great Warrior of Attila. Besides, he only knew Agon's Furious Horn by that title, and other than him had never known anyone else to be called that. Hearing this makes Kadim furious for some reason. Seeing his master rise in anger, the guide kneels and apologizes for his insolence. In his head, the MC thinks that this title is only given to one person among the Italans. It was a sacred title, granted only to the warrior who accepts the mission of assassinating the great demons in the name of the god of savagery and effort. In other words, there could only be one person with that title, and with the power to kill a great demon. So either the Furious Horn was using that title without knowing, or Attila had forgotten him, and chosen another great warrior. Kadim then sighs and calms down, saying it was not the merchant's fault, and telling him to rest because they would go to Molden at dawn. As he turns to go to his bed, the MC thinks that Agon's Furious Horn was either just pretending to be the great warrior, or he had been abandoned by Attila. However, that did not matter, because when he saw that guy, he would tear him to pieces. On the wall of Molden Castle, the guards were watching the entrance. The soldiers of Molden, looking ahead, can see the warriors led by Adlan standing still for some reason. Our MC and the guide were hidden in the bushes, merely observing Adlan's army. The merchant warns that there were hundreds of soldiers surrounding Molden, and there was no opening to get into the castle. Kadim then tells the man to find a safe place and hide, because he was going in there alone. The guide refuses, and starts arguing with his master. But suddenly, the gate begins to open. The pair manage to see this, and the confused merchant asks whether the Baron of Molden was opening the gate to declare war. Kadim thinks he does not know why the gate is opening, but he cannot hesitate, and so he opens his bottle of blood, then telling the merchant to hold on tight. After drinking the liquid, Kadim draws his sword and immediately charges forward. With the guide in his arms, the MC keeps heading toward the gate, determined to enter that kingdom once and for all. In front of the gate, an army was positioned. One of the soldiers senses something, and ends up looking back only to have his head quickly torn off. Without mercy, Kadim severs the head of another soldier. With blood in his eyes, the boy begins slaughtering anyone who appears in front of him. Even seeing their allies being cut down, the enemy soldiers remain motionless. Confused, the berserker wonders why there had been no commotion there, even though he had already taken down several opponents. In any case, it did not matter. So without mercy, the young man keeps advancing toward the gate, leaving a trail of death behind him. Then the barbarian jumps and sees in front of him yet another one of the soldiers surrounding the kingdom of Molden. Kadim ends up using the soldier as a landing strip, landing with his feet on top of the man's head, and finishing him off. After taking down all the enemies at the front of the formation, the berserk sighs relieved that he had finally reached the gate. Then he turns toward the gate, and upon seeing a blonde young man coming out, asks who the idiot was. The man reveals that he is Baron Molden, asking in return who the barbarian was. Kadim calls Molden a demonic baron and asks why he is outside the castle. The blonde tries to explain that the rumor about him being related to a demon was false. However, while heading toward the gate, Kadim retorts that he would only know whether the rumor was false if he saw it with his own eyes, then telling the baron to follow him. The baron, on the other hand, asks the barbarian to wait and explains that he could not go back like this because he had come there to sacrifice his life for the kingdom of Molden. Already fed up, the MC tells Molden to shut up, even saying he can kill himself later. Seeing this, the baron wonders when everything went wrong, and then in a flashback we see some surprised soldiers. They ask why the baron is there, but the man merely replies that since the soldiers had worked hard, he had brought water. The soldier feels guilty and asks why his lord had personally come to leave that there, and the baron simply comments that Delton had become a good soldier. Looking at the army outside, he comments that staying there on alert waiting for the enemy attack was much more exhausting. Besides that, they were all suffering because of him, an incompetent and filthy lord. Delton asks his lord not to talk nonsense, because the title of Demon Baron he received was the fault of Adlin's wicked swindlers, and following him was an honor. The baron closes his eyes for a second and sighs, then thanks him for those words, but says he cannot keep letting young men suffer because of him. Hearing that leaves the soldiers confused, not really understanding what he means. The next day, someone says the weather was getting warmer, so firewood would no longer be a concern. After finishing saying that, the Lord of Molden stares at the bedroom window. His wife says she knows he wasn't there just to talk about the weather, so she wanted to know the real reason for the visit. Ignoring that, the baron starts talking about when the woman bought tulips to plant last year. Then the young man praises the lady's good taste and laments that the tulips did not grow. On the other hand, the lady comments that the inside of the castle was starving and tulips did not matter at the moment. The baron reveals that he saw some children eating the tulip stems, and even though they were startled when they saw him, the children kept eating. Hearing that, the lady asks if he punished the children. Indignant, the baron states that he had no reason to punish those poor souls. After all, the people of this territory were suffering because of him. After 4 months isolated from the outside world, the winter supplies had run out some time ago, and the people had weapons instead of tools. The man then tells his wife that he would put an end to this today and die honorably, because then Viscount Adlin would no longer have a justification to besiege this place. Hearing that, the woman is shocked, and she quickly says that he was being unjustly accused of being related to a demon. The baron retorts that the truth did not matter. After all, if their goal were really noble, they would have already called the paladins to confirm the theory. If the Viscount did not retreat after his death, his wife should send a message to his majesty, and if he ignored this cruelty, the lady should go over to the alliance's side. Finally, the baron entrusts the future of Molden to his beloved wife. As he leaves, the man states that this battle would end with the death of the demon baron. Back in the present moment, Molden's soldiers arrive worried about their lord. The baron, on the other hand, wonders who the hell this barbarian was. Suddenly, one of Molden's men asks everyone to look at that, because Adlin's soldiers had gone mad. For some reason, Adlin's army starts behaving strangely, and with red eyes. One of them starts screaming like an animal. Seeing that, Kadim immediately turns around, finding the situation strange. The baron immediately orders his soldiers to close the gate. The gate begins to close, and in response all the enemy soldiers start heading toward the castle. As they run, the enemies scream and act like rabid animals. This leaves Molden's army confused, wondering why those guys were acting like that. Kadim takes the spear from one of the soldiers and says he was going to need those weapons. The barbarian then braces himself and uses all his strength to hurl the object toward the opponents, impaling and finishing off several of them. Seeing that leaves Molden's soldiers and the baron in shock, wondering who the hell this guy was. But Kadim ignores that and just asks for another spear. He keeps repeating the process and throwing several spears toward the enemies, finishing off a huge number of Adlin's soldiers. However, the soldiers keep acting like monsters and do not stop advancing. Afraid, Molden's army keeps trying to close the gate, but it ends up getting stuck. The baron wonders why the gate is not able to close, while Kadim simply analyzes the situation. One of the men warns his lord that the gate crank was not moving at all. Hearing that, the baron falls into despair, not knowing how to proceed. On the other hand, our MC realizes he needed to act. At that moment, the baron orders his men to organize themselves to protect the gate, while an engineer fixes the crank. Ignoring that, Kadim heads toward the metal gate. The baron, looking at the barbarian, becomes confused, seeing him place his hands on the gate, apparently for no reason. Kadim grabs the gate with both hands and with all his strength starts trying to close it. The gate slowly begins to lower, and while that was happening, Adlin's army advanced to try to invade Molden. The baron then orders his subordinates to protect the MC. The soldiers immediately obey and begin throwing their weapons toward the enemies. It works, and several opponents are finished off, slowing the assault a little. Kadim tells everyone to fall back, and then uses even more of his strength, managing to lower the gate and block the enemy army's passage. Then, turning around and stating that this should do for now, the baron and his soldiers are left in shock, wondering if this barbarian was really human. With his intimidating aura, Kadim asks to have a little talk with the Baron. Sometime later, we see a small banquet served on the table. While the guide eats non-stop, the Baron celebrates having guests after so long, and laments not having much to serve. Happy to finally be eating something decent, the merchant asks for another bowl of food. Kadim, on the other hand, remarks that it had been a long time since they were surrounded, so they shouldn't have had that much food. However, the Baron tells the barbarian not to worry, because he and his family could go hungry, and that was better than letting a guest starve. The MC realizes the man had a great deal of honor, and asks if that was why he had gone to take his own life, receiving confirmation right afterward. Berserk then reveals that he wants to know the whole story and what is happening there. The Baron then begins to explain. He explains that this place was a barren land without security, and in his youth he received an order from the Emperor to govern that territory. His goal became to make this place a good land to live in, and after dedicating himself for dozens of years, he managed to turn it into a prosperous place. However, all of that was ruined by the greed of one man, Viscount Adlan. Adlan was a neighboring territory with better conditions than Molden, but as this place gradually became a better place to live, the Viscount grew jealous and began spreading rumors that Baron Molden was a demon baron with a demonic contract. He even went so far as to say that Molden had prospered with demonic help, and at first that had no effect. The situation changed when the fourth prince fell in love with the Viscount's second daughter, because with that imperial connection, the Viscount became the most influential lord in the region. Because of that, the Viscount's words were no longer seen as nonsense, and with that approval, the subjugation of the demon baron began. Using that lie as an excuse, Adlan surrounded Molden with 400 soldiers about 4 months ago, and because he could no longer bear to watch his people suffer, he was going to sacrifice himself. Kadim comments that he finds this situation strange, because while Molden was already starving after 4 months, Adlan was maintaining an army of 400 men without any gains. The Baron replies that he does not know how that was possible, and that the only answer would be that Adlan was being helped by the imperial family, but that leaves the MC deep in thought. The Baron says it is Kadim's turn to explain things, especially why he had gone so far to get there, even attacking one of Adlan's camps to do so. The barbarian reveals that he went to Molden because there was something he was looking for, then asks if there was a fist-shaped stone there in the center of the castle. Hearing that leaves the blonde man confused, and he asks how Kadim knew that, because there really was such a stone in the basement. The warrior of Atala stands up and asks the Baron to take him there, saying that he would leave the city once he found the object he was interested in. Unfortunately, the Baron refuses and states that entering the basement is forbidden. Kadim even asks why, but the Baron quickly retorts that he could not reveal that to a foreigner. That leaves our MC furious, and seeing this, the guide realizes that the atmosphere had suddenly become awkward. On top of that, the Baron, who had been kind before, was now very firm. Our MC and the Baron of that city stare at each other for a moment, with tension in the air. Faced with this situation, the MC sighs while thinking that things had been going too well to be true. Suddenly, the young man draws a small knife and prepares to do something. With the knife, Kadim strikes toward the Baron, but for some reason only hits the table in front of him, and that leaves the man frightened. After piercing an insect with the blade, the barbarian says that tomorrow the 100 soldiers in the castle would end up the same way as that insect. On top of that, the poor men would not be able to flee either, because outside was full of enemies, and even if they hid, they would not survive for long. All the soldiers would end up like that insect, crushed without even knowing where the blow came from, and they would lose their lives in vain. Finally, Kadim says that he did not want to know why the Baron would not let him go to the basement, but that he would give the man a choice. Either he would silently guide him to the basement now, or Molden would be painted with innocent blood. Hearing all that leaves the Baron tense, thinking that coming from this guy, it was not an empty threat, and in the end it was all his fault, because he should not have let an intruder with unknown intentions enter. Then, the Lord agrees to guide Kadim to the basement, but says he has one condition for it. So the barbarian asks what the condition was. The Baron asks Kadim to help defend the castle if Viscount Adlan attacked, because after his death, the Viscount might still try to launch an attack anyway. In addition, he had instructed his butler to guide Berserk to the basement as soon as he repelled the attack. After hearing all that, Kadim calls the Baron ridiculous and asks if he really thought that death was honorable, because the idiot was going to give up fighting and leave the consequences for a complete stranger to deal with. Basically, he was going to abandon everything and die, as if he were running away. So the MC asks once again if he really thought that was an honorable death. Hearing that, the Baron can only remain silent in reflection. Our MC says that at first sacrificing himself for others seemed noble, but the man was actually just throwing the burden onto others and running from responsibility. However, the way of his Atalan people was different because even with their limbs twisted, even against a much stronger enemy, the Atalans fight until the end. That was what an honorable death for an Atalan truly was. Looking at the insect, the Baron seems to have changed his mind. Kadim then decides to make the man another offer, and so the two talk for a long time. After finishing saying everything, the MC asks whether the Lord agreed, and so he asks for some time to think, then telling Kadim to wait in the guest room. The butler guides our MC and the merchant to the guest room, and the two enter the place to wait for the Baron's answer. The barbarian tells the merchant to take the bed and rest, leaving him confused. Then the big guy places his sword on the table and sits down to rest a little. The guide does the same, taking his huge bag off his back. As he sits down, the young man asks whether his lord thinks the Baron would accept the offer. Kadim simply replies that it wasn't as if the man had much choice. The guide says he thought things were calm for a moment, but suddenly the Baron who had been so kind became inflexible, and he didn't seem like the type of person who would refuse without a good reason, so he wanted to know why the man was trying to block access to the basement. Our MC simply replies that the reason was obvious. On the other hand, hearing that leaves the merchant confused. Suddenly the door opens and the Baron enters the room looking determined and convinced of his decision. Kadim comments that the young man came back early and asks if he had changed his mind, and the Baron simply confirms with a nod. Sometime later, in the middle of the night, the moonlight illuminated Molden's wall. Up there, the guards watch the area around the castle. Suddenly, one of them is startled when he hears a noise, so they point their spears at the Baron and Kadim. However, the Lord identifies himself and tells Delton to lower his spear. Confused, Delton asks why the Baron is there at this hour, dressed in armor. The Baron tells the officer in command, Delton, to compose himself and not panic. Delton even tries to ask more questions, confused by the whole situation, but the Lord only asks him to help tie that rope, then also asking them not to step outside the castle, no matter what happened. So the soldiers gather and tie the rope to part of the wall. Kadim grabs onto it, and without hesitation, jumps rappelling all the way down. The soldiers are impressed by the boy's agility. With a bit more care, the Baron prepares to descend. Before that, the man says the name of each of his soldiers calling to them, and they all answer back. Thus, before leaving, the Baron says he is entrusting them with a very important treasure, then asks the soldiers to protect Molden. They all begin to cry, but confirm. Then, the Baron finally descends. Impatient, Kadim asks if the Baron is done with the farewells, already receiving a yes in response right after. Thus, with his sword in hand, our MC and his ally set out to put an end to Viscount Adlin. In a flashback, we see the Baron in disbelief. The MC says that during the night, the two of them would attack Adlin's camp, and just a sword and a spear would be enough. The Baron asks if the barbarian really wants just the two of them to charge against the enemy camp, since that would be suicide. However, the Berserk simply replies that the man was going to do that anyway, and hearing that puts the blonde man on alert. Kadim adds that even if he died or fought to the end, once the demonic Baron died, the Adlins would lose their justification. The Baron even agrees but argues that if he really attacked the camp, Viscount Adlin would retaliate by attacking Molden. Kadim, however, tells the young man not to worry, because he would put an end to that in tonight's ambush. Though still reluctant, the Baron begins to change his mind. Then our MC promises to help defend Molden if they fail to finish off Adlin in tonight's ambush. In his head, the king thinks that was an arrogant answer, since Kadim wasn't even considering the possibility of dying, but it made sense because he was very strong. Kadim finally adds that if the Baron was thinking of dying anyway, this offer would be much better because it would eliminate the root of this disaster. At Adlin's camp, we see two soldiers guarding the entrance. Suddenly a sword is thrown and ends up piercing one of the idiots. The other one turns when he sees his companion falling, not really understanding the situation, and with a dumb look on his face, he barely seems to react. At that moment, Kadim charges forward, finishing off the soldier and driving his sword through his body. With a spear in his hands, the Baron follows our protagonist. The MC, on the other hand, still finds the situation strange, because even seeing their companions die, those guys showed no reaction. Something catches Kadim's attention, and looking closely, he realizes the soldiers had thin, skeletal faces, and their bodies were skin and bone. Seeing that, the MC understands that those guys had been starving for days, and all the other enemies must have been the same. After analyzing that, the barbarian turns around and stares at the Baron for a moment, leaving the man confused. After the stare, Kadim turns back around and moves to enter the camp. There, the enemy soldiers walked as if they had no life in them. Confused, the Baron questions how it was possible for those guys to be wandering around in that heavy armor in the middle of the night. One of the skeletal soldiers looks to the side, noticing the presence of the Baron and the MC. Thus, several enemies turn toward the two of them. The Berserk then tells the blonde man to stay there and finish off as many soldiers as he could, while he would go deeper in to take a look. Hearing this, the king retorts by asking what he was looking for. Kadim complains that the Baron is only asking the obvious, and says he was going after Viscount Adlin. After all, since he was the commander, the demon's influence should be stronger on him. The Baron is startled to hear that, and Kadim simply tells him to devote himself body and soul to the battle. The Baron agrees and says those enemies were the ones responsible for harming his most precious treasure, Molden. Our MC then spins his two little daggers, and in a quick motion throws all of them, managing to take out two opponents. Next, our hero draws his sword and another axe, charging forward and slicing down a few more soldiers. Meanwhile, Kadim only thinks that those guys were nothing more than puppets. The Baron, on the other hand, watches this massacre in silence. At that moment, one of the soldiers has his head separated from his body, while another ends up getting a small cut across his throat. One of the puppets tries to counterattack, but is quickly finished off by the MC. After that, Kadim thinks that the deeper he went into the camp, the stronger the resistance became, and the crazier the soldiers seemed. So Adlin was concentrating the malevolent will to stop him, and that meant that he had reached the right place. The MC then enters one of the tents, and there comes face to face with his target. Beside Lord Adlin, two soldiers were having their vitality drained. Adlin then absorbs all the purple energy around him, and as he does, all the soldiers begin to collapse, too weak to remain standing. On the other hand, the madman opens his eyes, revealing that his eye was black and his pupil red. With a demonic aura, Adlin congratulates the MC for making it that far, and calls him a dog. Seeing this makes Kadim give a little smile, and say that even on his first try, he had only run into a few of these. This demon was a possession variant, and it was quite rare. Annoyed, Adlin asks why his enemy is laughing. Next, the demon says that Kadim had too much confidence in his strong body, but before him the barbarian was nothing more than an insect, so he should leave. He even claims to have cultivated this tree for many years, and that it was time to harvest the fruits. Kadim takes a step forward, and while complaining that Adlin talks too much, he draws his sword. The demon gets irritated that Kadim did not back down, and says that as retaliation he would take his life. Next, the Lord begins to summon a sinister and powerful aura. Seeing this puts our hero on alert. With this demonic aura, the Lord tells Kadim to say goodbye to his insignificant ego, because from now on the barbarian's life would belong to him. The demonic aura goes toward our MC, and begins to do something to his body. In his head, Adlin thinks that he was pouring all his demonic malice into this guy, so if there were even the slightest opening it would infiltrate and take control of his body. However, he notices something strange after all. He couldn't dominate this barbarian's body. This leaves the Viscount frightened, refusing to believe that this was possible. Next, the demon asks who Kadim was and why he couldn't dominate him. While cracking his neck, the boy apologizes for that, and explains that this body already had an owner. The Viscount falls silent for a moment, thinking that his possession had only failed once, and that was when he tried to use it on a higher level demon. For a moment he thought there was a superior demon inside Kadim, but after looking closely, the barbarian was nothing more than an idiotic human. Because of that, being defeated by a mere human filled him with rage. The Viscount begins transforming his body, while telling the dog not to get full of himself. The demon's body begins to grow larger, and take on a terrifying form. After finishing his transformation, he declares that he would crush Kadim until he turned him into dust. Then the monster grabs the handle of his weapon, and tries to attack Kadim with the spiked ball. Our MC seems to get hit, and ends up being pushed a few steps back. We see that the young man had defended himself with his axe, and it was already practically unusable. Seeing this sets off an alarm in him. However, without giving his enemy time to think, the Viscount charges in to attack again. Kadim then jumps back, barely dodging the blow. The giant demon and the barbarian stare at each other for a moment. Adlin starts mocking Kadim, because earlier he had been so confident, but now he was running away with his tail between his legs. Looking at his destroyed axe, the MC thinks that this weapon is large because it was made for the demon to use in this giant form, and an ordinary weapon would not withstand the fight. For some reason, the Berserker looks back toward the castle. Seeing this, the demon asks if the barbarian was looking for a place to run. Suddenly, several enemy soldiers appear, surrounding Kadim. Adlin comments that the barbarian killed a few, but he still had 300 bodies to use. At that moment, one of the soldiers charges with a sword and along with him another charges with a spear. Kadim manages to dodge both attacks at the same time. With his axe he brings down an overhead strike, splitting the guy with the spear in two, and with his sword, takes out the other enemy. The Viscount wastes no time, and uses his Morning Star to strike Kadim but ends up missing the attack, hitting the ground and causing massive destruction. After that, the ugly bastard says there was nowhere for Kadim to run. Our MC, on the other hand, only watches the enemy. After another attack from the enemy, the MC has to jump back to avoid getting hit, landing a few meters from where he was. Adlin walks forward while saying that the barbarian really was good at running away. Once again, the Berserk looks back toward the castle. The demon notices this, and questions why the young man keeps looking over there, then says that if Kadim is thinking of running away, it would be useless. At this moment, a person runs in one direction. Meanwhile, the Viscount keeps mocking his enemy, saying he should have known his place before crashing someone else's banquet after all. A human body can never face a demon, and if he really wanted to defeat the Berserk, he should at least have brought the dogs of Elga. Kadim shoots back that he really should have done that, because the way things were now, it would be hard to destroy his muscle puppet, but his real body would not be so difficult, and upon hearing that, the demon is shocked. At that moment, the guide arrives there, out of breath and calling for his lord. Smiling, Kadim says that even a weak traveling merchant could destroy the demon's true body. The creature seems to take the threat seriously, becoming quite frightened. The demon seems to sense something, and looks toward the castle in fear. We then see that a strange lump of flesh had been pierced by a dagger. Immediately, the demon screams furiously, cursing our mech. Seeing that reaction, Kadim only gives a little smile. In a flashback, we see Kadim explaining to the merchant that the Baron was hiding a demon there in the basement. This leaves the guide confused, saying he thought the reason the Baron had barred them from entering the basement was because he was hiding some treasure. Kadim explains that given the Baron's personality, he would have handed over the treasure just because they had helped earlier. Besides that, the man valued honor greatly, and if someone like that refused a guest's request, he had to be hiding something. So at that moment the two of them arrive near the door leading into the basement. Looking closely, the merchant sees a huge padlock with chains on the door, and starts complaining about it. Our mech approaches the padlock with utter brutality, breaking it apart, and forcing the door open with brute strength. Then he asks the merchant to go down to the basement when the moon passes its peak, and once inside, to look for a strange mass of flesh and stab this dagger into it. Hearing that frightens the merchant, since they were dealing with a demon. But Kadim tells the young man not to worry, because the demon will be busy dealing with him, so there will not be a trace of malice left in its body. Back in the present moment, the demon stretches out his hand and realizes he is unable to reach his main body with his malice. This leaves the creature furious, screaming in rage. In a state of fury, the monster starts shouting as he declares that he would finish Kadim off in a painful way. The Viscount even goes so far as to describe how he would do it. From atop the wall, now together with the soldiers, the merchant notices that the monster has grown in size. Kadim thinks that even without the main body, and no longer able to control the malice, the monster would only disappear if all its vessels were destroyed. With his weapon, the monster tries to strike Kadim, but the Mick manages to dodge again. The barbarian then tries to counterattack with his axe, but the moment it makes contact with the monster's skin, the weapon shatters. Seeing this, the demon starts laughing, and he asks if the berserk really thought he could hurt him with a weapon like that. The monster then tries once again to hit the Mick, misses, and strikes one of his own allies. After jumping back, our Mick starts to slow himself down while looking at his destroyed axe. The Viscount then says that as revenge he would wipe out everyone in Molden, but first he would put an end to Kadim. At that moment, the barbarian shouts, calling for the merchant, leaving the ugly monster confused. Upon hearing his master's call, the guide agrees and gets ready to throw the axe requested by him. Then, the weakling throws the axe as high as he can and the weapon goes spinning, stopping just a few meters above the ground. In his head, the guide thinks that the barbarian told him to throw the axe without hesitation, but because of his lack of strength, the weapon had only gone up a few meters. In his mind, Kadim tells the merchant not to worry, because if this axe really was made by a dwarf, it would prove its worth on its own. And then in the air the axe begins to spin by itself and for no reason at all, heads toward the Mick, stopping right in his hand. After taking hold of the object, Kadim stares at the beautiful weapon for a moment. After seeing the axe accelerate through the air on its own and stop in Kadim's hand, the merchant is left in shock. The demon seems to recognize it and becomes frightened. While admiring that treasure, our mecha curses the Baron for letting that treasure rot beside that ugly demon. Frightened, the Viscount comments that this axe was made by the mad dwarves of the north, then asks if Kadim had come to Molden from the very beginning in search of it. Ignoring that, the mecha grabs his sword and readies himself with his new axe. Then the berserk states that for a possessor-type demon, he talked too much. Right after that, the mecha braces himself and throws the axe, while commenting that he was going to shut the creature up. Seeing the weapon flying toward him, the demon says he does not care because all he needed to do was destroy it with his mace. The axe then finally draws near the Viscount's weapon and ends up shattering it into pieces. Seeing the axe close to his face, the demon comments that it makes no sense for a weapon of solid steel to have been shattered so easily, but the beautiful axe keeps advancing and ends up making half of the demon's body disappear. Seeing the damage done, Kadim gets excited for finally having obtained a good weapon. At that moment, the merchant starts climbing down the rope, impressed by the situation. Suddenly, from the demon's body begins to come out a strange black smoke. Kadim thinks the malice was dissipating, and if the main body were still alive, destroying a few vessels would be pointless. But since the malice was deeply rooted in the other vessels, the only possible thing to do would be to destroy them all. Suddenly, a familiar figure appears there, wielding a sword. Seeing something, the merchant tries to warn his master. The figure then rushes in to try to stab the Mick, but he manages to dodge. Looking closely, Kadim recognizes Baron Molden. The berserk tries to speak to the Baron, but he apparently had already been taken over by the demonic malice. Having possessed the new body, the demon turns and asks the wild dog if he really thought it was over. This leaves the berserk furious. In his head, he thinks that as expected, the demon had already planted malice in the Baron. The demon comments that the Baron thought he could save Molden by sacrificing himself, but its desire was to keep him alive to watch his entire kingdom destroyed and his people slaughtered. After so long, it was only one step away from savoring that. But Kadim ruined everything. Mishing understands, that was the reason the demon had planted malice in the Baron, because it wanted to keep him alive to witness that scene. Pointing his sword at his opponent, the monster asks whether Kadim could tear the Baron apart just like he did with Viscount Adlin. On the other hand, Mick warns that the creature was wrong, because he did not get involved in this for Molden's sake, but because he had made a deal with the Baron, and the reason he brought the man there was so he could deal with things easily when this moment came. Even hearing that, the demon laughs and says that the soldiers were watching all of this, so if Kadim killed the Baron, he would be hunted down. Kadim then retorts that it would be the same if the demon survived after taking over the Baron's body. Besides, if Molden turned against him and attacked, he would just kill everyone. Hearing that from this guy, the demon understands that it was not a bluff, so it decides to let Kadim kill the Baron with his own hands after all. It was now only a fragment of malice, and even if it could not destroy Molden by itself, it could still absorb the Baron's agony, while he watched his soldiers die at Kadim's hands. Seeing his opponent coming toward him, Kadim seems to hesitate, but for some reason the Baron stops short, halting his attack. Armek seems impressed seeing the Baron place his hand over his face. For some reason the young man turns the blade of his sword, pointing it at himself. Regaining a bit of consciousness, the Baron says that the demon would not lay its hands on Molden. Confused, the creature curses the Baron while wondering how he was resisting, and even Kadim does not seem to fully understand. Moving to end his own life, the man declares that he would drag the monster to hell with him. As he tries to pierce his armor, the sword's tip ends up breaking off even so. He does not give up, using all his remaining strength to run himself through. The poor man's lifeblood falls to the ground. Seeing this scene from atop the wall, all the soldiers seem confused. After the blow, the Baron falls to his knees on the ground. The fragment of malice asks how this madman managed to stab himself even while possessed. Regaining his consciousness, the Baron sighs while Kadim approaches him. Confused, the merchant asks if the Baron was dead, but the berserk denies it. Kadim crouches down and praises the Baron's strength for having managed to pierce that thick armor. The man, on the other hand, says he only managed it because of the demon's power, and even this time, he had depended on that grotesque creature. For the first time, the mech seems to become a little sad. Next, Kadim places his mosquito sword in the Baron's hand, beginning to cut himself and transfer a little vitality to him. This eases the man's pain a little, making him feel lighter. Armek thinks that the sword's vampirism works even when wielded by someone else, but because of the fatal wound, it would only delay his death a little. Our hero then explains that when an ordinary person faces a demon, their will to live is shattered. However, unlike them, the Baron did not give up and expelled the malice. After being highly praised by Kadim, the Baron says that it was an honor, and having a warrior of Kadim's level by his side at the end was incredible. Thinking about what final words to say, the young man says he has only complaints and regrets. Then, beginning to say that he should have destroyed that demon when he found it. In a flashback, we see the monster asking whether the Baron did not wish to turn Molden into the greatest territory in the region. The man says that the demon offered him that, and in return asked only that he devote himself to and love the people, and that land as if they were his children. Even thinking that was a strange condition for a demon, he ended up accepting, and without realizing it fell into a fatal trap. The creature kept its promise and Molden prospered, and he also did his best to fulfill his part of the deal. But it reached a point where he truly began to love Molden sincerely, yet the more that love grew, the greater his anxiety became, because none of it was his, but the demon's. He lived with the constant fear of losing everything, so he spent many of his days consumed by anxiety, and eventually that day came, through Viscount Adlin. Hearing this, Kadim thinks the demon wanted to savor the Baron's pain and despair when he had lost everything. Struggling to stay alive, the Baron remarks that for Molden's rebirth, destroying the demon, and saving his city, he depended on another person's strength for all of it. But the Amek immediately disagrees, since in the end it was the man's own will that drove out the demon. Hearing that makes the Baron a little happy, saying that at least in the end he managed to do something with his own strength. And Kadim agrees. Before leaving, the Lord asks the barbarian to deliver those words to his wife, Delpina. Then, with his last strength, he apologizes for not being able to protect the tulips. Thus, the noble Baron passes on to a better place. This seems to really affect the mech, leaving him a little sad. The next day, the people of Molden were gathered. Inside a coffin, the Baron's body was resting. His wife and the soldiers, all were saddened by this situation. The citizens raise flags and pray for the soul of their king who had passed away. While the funeral was taking place, Armek was looking in another direction, avoiding watching the event. Outside the walls, Delton was examining the dead demon's body without saying anything. Another soldier appears and informs his captain that most of the soldiers' bodies had been taken for burial, and all that was left was to burn the demon's body. Then he also asks what had happened there, since the demon fighting the barbarian was Viscount Adlin. Besides that, Adlin's soldiers who died should not even have been moving, since they were malnourished. It also made no sense for the Baron to have taken his own life, and the barbarian would not open his mouth to explain the situation. Hearing this leaves Delton thoughtful. In a flashback, we see the barbarian carrying the Baron's body, while all the soldiers try to understand the situation. Kadim stops walking, saying that the Baron had fought his enemy until his last breath, and that was all the soldiers needed to know. Finally, the Mick tells the idiots to open the gates because the Baron was someone who deserved to rest in his greatest treasure, Molden. Back in the present moment, Delton states that the Baron fought his enemy until the end, and that he loved Molden very much. Therefore, from now on, they would carry on his will, and they would protect Molden. After all, that was the Baron's most precious treasure. So after saying that, Delton leaves to clean up the rest of that mess. At that moment, the Baroness arrives where the barbarian and the merchant were. The woman says she is deeply indebted to the mercenary, because even without any prior connection, he helped Molden and fought against the enemies. Therefore, in the name of her late husband, she thanked him from the bottom of her heart. However, the barbarian says there is no need for any more thanks after all. That axe was already his payment. Even hearing that, the young woman is not convinced, then saying that this was not enough, so she had prepared some coins and food, even knowing it would not be enough. Kadim refuses the gift, asking her to keep it. The young man also talks about a valley where a bandit group's base used to be, and there was food and supplies there. Besides that, he had already dealt with the enemies, so she should bring everything from there and distribute it to the people. Hearing this, the Baroness becomes extremely grateful, and says that Molden will have an eternal debt to the barbarian. Not only that, because from now on, all of Kadim's enemies would be enemies of Molden, and if he had the chance, he should visit again, and when the barbarian returned, he would be treated with the utmost respect. The Mick turns around, saying he cannot promise, but that one day he would try to return there. Then, before leaving, he remembers something and asks if the young woman's name was Delpina. Hearing this, leaves the woman confused, asking how the barbarian knew her name. Kadim ignores the question and simply says that the Baron had left a message for her. Thus, the young man repeats the Baron's last words about the tulips. After hearing this, the woman remembers when she planted the flowers with her husband, and ends up getting emotional, starting to cry. The barbarian also says that the man faced an honorable death, showing enough strength to overcome a demon, not as the demon Baron, but as the Lord of Molden. Therefore, the young woman could be proud of him, and after saying that the Mick leaves, far from there, the merchant was telling how he had heroically defeated the demon, and hearing this guy lie makes the Mick angry, telling him to shut up immediately. Then, Kadim asks if the merchant brought that thing, and the young man confirms it by showing a leather bottle. The barbarian thinks that, given the type of that demon, its blood should grant immunity bonuses against mental attacks, although it probably would not work against the most terrible affliction, insanity. Therefore, Kadim decides that when he finds Melissa at the tower, he will look for a solution to his insanity condition. However, the young man remains upbeat. After all, he had obtained an incredibly good weapon, so his dependence on demonic blood should decrease a little. Our mech thinks he has never seen a weapon of this level, not even in his first attempt or in the game, and the map labeled the axe as an ancient treasure. That is, it was forged a long time ago in the Age of Myths, when the races fought for supremacy over the continent. And if it really was made in that era, it must be unique level. Still confused, the young man wonders how a treasure of this caliber was hidden in a place like this. Hearing this, the merchant gets nervous and snaps back that there had been a white symbol drawn on the chest, but because it was dark, he couldn't see it. Kadim thinks that was a troubling clue, but he couldn't go back to Molden just to check it. Besides, he had left a long trail of blood all the way there, and if someone was tracking him, they should find him soon. The most likely pursuers would be Elga's Holy Knights, and a lower-ranking paladin wouldn't be a problem, but the real problem would be if it were an arch-paladin. Thinking of that possibility, the Mick remembers when he was almost subdued by one, and it makes him bite his lips while saying it brought back bitter memories, then cursing the paladins as damned fanatics. Nearby, we see Helia riding on horseback and complaining that Eden was too slow. The man apologizes for it, but Helia remains irritated. Looking ahead, the girl seems thoughtful, then comments that they were already close to Molden. Back to the mech, the merchant tells the Lord that he couldn't go by this path because if he kept following this road, he would end up right beside the border guard post. So the merchant asks them to turn back and take that side trail. Kadim realizes he had quickened his pace without meaning to, because of the anxiety over possibly being hunted, and because of those memories. So then he simply agrees with the merchant and starts changing course. At that moment, the merchant begins remembering when the Baron took his own life, and Kadim's respect for him. So the man calls out to the Lord, but when he sees Kadim's expression he gives up and says it's nothing. Barmik then merely sighs and draws his axe, then starts breaking some tree branches. Helia, on her horse, was riding quickly, but the animal suddenly stops and she tells it to calm down. The blonde sighs, a little impatiently, and after a while, Aiden finally manages to catch up. Aiden and his horse were completely out of breath from running so much. Helia says they weren't making any progress at all, and asks whether Aiden really couldn't keep up any faster. Aidan laments it, but says it was impossible to go any faster on an ordinary horse. while thinking it was easy for her to say that while riding a radiant horse, a divine steed granted only to an arch-paladin, whose speed and endurance depended solely on the paladin's abilities. Idan then asks if they really weren't going through Molden, because that way they could gather information about the demon and check the rumors about the demon baron. Hylia comments that the order had received a recommendation from the imperial family not to meddle in that territory, and right now the priority was catching Linton's killer so Eden couldn't dare forget his duties. The soldier thinks that's ridiculous, then wonders if massacring innocent women and shattering a sacred relic were the missions of a knight. Hylia says it was impossible to go on like this. Then she says that, judging by the route, the demon's destination was Alliance territory, and at this rate he would cross the border, so she would go on ahead of Adon. Adon even tries to ask the lady to wait, but with her horse, she vanishes over the horizon in the blink of an eye, leaving the soldier behind speechless. Seeing this, Adon curses his commander, and realizing he lost his temper, he ends up apologizing to God. Then the young man asks why this was so unfair, because for Elga to grant such great power and exceptional blessings to someone so flawed, instead of to one of the faithful, didn't seem right. But immediately Eden sees that he was having profane thoughts. After all, everything was Elga's will, and should not be questioned. After reflecting, the soldier gets down from his horse while thinking that a tiny little fish like him would never understand God's will. However, something catches his attention. Looking down, he ends up seeing the barbarian's footprints, but notices they change direction for some reason. Then Aiden looks at the vegetation beside him, noticing several branches and vines scattered in an unnatural way. This sets off an alarm in the soldier, so he ties his horse to a nearby tree. After finishing, the man draws his shield and sword, setting out to investigate it. After some time passes, Aiden seems out of breath, thinking he had gone too deep in there, and instead of the path ending, the forest seemed to be getting denser. Besides, that vegetation wasn't even supposed to be there. Then the soldier wonders how the filthy demon knew about that alternate trail, until he hears some voices talking. As he hides, he manages to hear the merchant talking with Kadim. After locating his enemy, Aiden celebrates inwardly, while thinking that Kadim was exactly as the sacred relic had shown. In his head, the man wonders whether he really could subdue this barbarian, someone capable of shattering a sacred relic with just his reflexes. Aiden then tells himself he had already done his part, and so he would leave that success-crazed arch-paladin to deal with it alone. So the soldier turns to leave, declaring that he only needed to report this to Hylia. However, while leaving, Aiden ends up bumping into a branch, and apparently Kadim seems to hear it. In his head, the soldier curses the branch, but thinks it was humanly impossible for someone to hear something that quiet from that distance. At that moment, the barbarian turns around in all his fury, and hurls his axe toward the forest. Eden notices the attack coming, braces himself, and barely manages to block it with his shield. The force of the axe ends up pushing the soldier backward, leaving him breathless after nearly being obliterated. Eden is utterly shocked to see his blessed weapon nearly destroyed in a single blow, but before he can think any further, the man is startled. Suddenly, Kadim appears above him, launching into combat with a terrifying expression. Our MC charges forward and tries to pierce his enemy with his sword. When Eden sees that Kadim was aiming for the gap in his helmet, he barely manages to dodge to the side. Next, the barbarian lands on the enemy's shield and grabs his axe, which was stuck there, pulling it free while jumping back at the same time. Just that brute's leap alone sends Eden crashing to the ground. The soldier thinks the consecration of his sacred weapon has vanished, so getting up with the weight of that shield was almost impossible. Immediately, Kadim approaches the fallen enemy and moves in to attack him. With no other choice, Eden lets go of his shield, and just as he was about to be struck by the barbarian, he manages to get up, dodging the attack. Confused, the soldier is impressed by the sight of Kadim's weapon and his monstrous strength. Looking at his shield, now pierced through, the man thinks that if he hadn't abandoned the weapon and dodged, he would be dead. Kadim says it isn't normal for a holy knight to take this path, then asks if Eden tracked him there. Seeing his enemy remain silent, our MC says he was alone, and it wouldn't be hard to make him talk. Hearing that frightens Eden, so he steps back and raises his sword. Then the man begins to recite some sacred words, and a golden light appears on his weapon. However, to keep him from continuing, the MC throws his axe. With no other choice, Eden is forced to dodge, so the axe passes by him and hits a tree, destroying it. Kadim asks if the holy man really thought he would be allowed to cast that kind of magic in peace, and right after that, he tells the merchant to retrieve his axe. Looking at his sword, the soldier realizes he failed to receive the blessing, since he was interrupted before the enchantment was completed. Impatient, Kadim leaps toward the enemy once more. Seeing his opponent appear right in front of him, Eden tries to defend himself, barely blocking the blow. Eden wonders what kind of monstrous strength this was. Our MC then quickly pushes the enemy's sword aside, and moves to pierce him, aiming for the vulnerable parts of his armor. Eden barely manages to avoid the attack and immediately realizes the barbarian's idea, understanding that besides being strong, he was experienced. So our MC turns to brutality, unleashing several blows. Eden begins to be overwhelmed, thinking that with every block his wrists almost broke, and fighting this guy was almost like fighting a monster disguised as a human. At that moment, Kadim knocks Eden's sword downward, then grabs his arm. The barbarian then aims for a vulnerable spot, managing to strike the soldier's shoulder. After driving the sword in, Kadim starts twisting it, then yanks it out all at once, causing massive damage. After suffering that blow, Eden starts gushing ketchup, even dropping his sword and groaning in pain. Seeing his enemy in that state, Kadim mocks him, saying the boy was far too weak to even be a paladin. Frustrating as it was, Eden understands it is impossible to fight with his right arm in that condition, so he crouches down and picks up his sword and throws it toward the demon. While Kadim dodges the weapon, Eden takes the chance to flee. Kadim grabs the axe the merchant brought him, and starts going after his prey. The soldier runs desperately through the forest, tearing off his own helmet and throwing it far away. He thinks that if he reaches the horse, he'll be able to warn the chief. An axe flies straight into his back, hitting dead center. The paladin falls at the foot of a tree as the barbarian approaches, picks up the axe and orders him to answer his questions. The big man asks if there are more knights with him, but Eden spits that he doesn't talk to monsters, and tells the barbarian to just finish him off. Kadim merely raises the axe and strikes the knight in the shoulder. The soldier screams in pain. The protagonist asks why he should kill him, when leaving him alive would be far more painful. Then he pulls the axe from his shoulder and repeats the question. In the background, the skinny man watches the torture, breaking into a cold sweat at the brutality. The paladin remains silent and sees that the only way for him to stay quiet is by biting off his own tongue. The guide is shocked to see him bite off his own tongue. The paladin spits blood and Kadim warns that this resistance is pointless. Then he grabs his face and demands answers through blinks, raising the axe over his shoulder and warning him to think carefully if he wants the torture to end soon. The soldier trembles in fear. He asks if the archbishop and the lancer are holy knights. When he doesn't answer, the barbarian drives the axe into the middle of the soldier's head. The soldier collapses, blood running down his face, and Kadim notices the peaceful expression he made. Then he pulls out the axe, concluding that the arch-paladin is coming after them. Then he leaves the body behind. The guide runs after the barbarian and asks why he's in such a hurry, questioning whether torturing the man wasn't too much. He tries to defend the soldier, saying he might not have known anything, but Kadim asks if the merchant has ever had his tongue ripped out by roots. The guide can only ask, how? Kadim goes on, mentioning skin burned alive and shattered bones, making the merchant fall silent. Then he explains that his group was once hunted by an arch-paladin, and was nearly wiped out over a misunderstanding. Without forcing the information out of the soldier, that could happen again. The skinny man lowers his head, taking it in. Then the protagonist tells him to listen carefully. The barbarian warns that he won't show mercy just to avoid ending up stabbed in his sleep, and that he would commit any atrocity to reach his goal. That's how it's always been, and how it always will be. The guide's legs start shaking immediately, imagining being discarded once he loses his usefulness. The big man just stares at him coldly, while he panics and asks how to avoid being treated like trash, begging to know what he needs to do to earn the same respect as Baron Molden. The barbarian warns that if he doesn't want to die, he'll have to prove the value of his own life. The skinny man swallows hard and goes back to following the big man in silence. Later, in that same forest, the arch-paladin arrives at the scene. She finds Eden's horse tied up, but sees no sign of the paladin. The blonde moves along the trail until her eyes go wide. She finds the paladin's sword lying on the ground, and realizes he is already dead. Far from there, the barbarian pushes through the woods and calls the merchant. The skinny man startles, fearing he'll be the next victim, but the protagonist only says that the trail is strange. The guide swallows hard and confesses that they got lost a long time ago, but he was afraid to say so, regretting opening his mouth the moment he does. The skinny man apologizes desperately, explaining that they should have reached the border by now. The big man tells him to open the map and check whether there's any forest that large on their route. The guide checks everything and says there isn't. The barbarian even suspects the map might be fake, but the merchant swears he paid a lot for it, and that it's very recent. The protagonist looks around and realizes they aren't walking in circles, so he suspects something is preventing them from getting out. Then he calls the merchant again, and orders the poor man to climb the tallest tree to look for a way out. From up there, the coward mutters that climbing higher wouldn't help at all, until he spots a huge column of black smoke on the horizon. While they check out the black smoke, a giant snake appears, and attacks the protagonist from behind. The big man grabs the snake just in time and snaps it in half, splitting it into two pieces. He holds the bloodied snake as it thrashes. He throws the piece of the snake to the ground, but it keeps writhing, making the protagonist uneasy. When he sees the monster's bizarre regeneration, in seconds, the snake is whole again, but smaller and with two tails. The guide clings to the tree, terrified, and panics when he sees the rest of the snake in the barbarian's hand. The little mutant snake slithers off into the brush, leaving the skinny man speechless, and trying not to be left there. But the protagonist is focused on something else, and heads toward a campfire. The barbarian approaches, finding a hooded man sitting alone. He stops in front of him, looking him up and down, until the hooded man introduces himself, Nazran. The protagonist stays silent. Observing the figure, the man with the completely disfigured face asks their names. The skinny man steps forward and introduces them both, while the barbarian watches him. Nazran explains that he is a leper with nowhere to go, making the guide break into a cold sweat and hide behind the protagonist. The man says the forest is good because no one throws stones at him there. The protagonist smiles faintly and says the healers used to do that in the old days. The barbarian asks if he knows the forest, since the place doesn't even appear on the map. The man gives a bizarre smile and says he can help, but the information won't come for free. The guide shrinks back and offers food and money, but the hooded man refuses and asks only for an exchange of stories. Licking his lips, he asks if barbarian women are really that good in bed. The sick man says that with enough money, any woman would spread her legs for him. The merchant panics, thinking the barbarian is going to crack his skull right there. But the barbarian ignores the provocation and asks why his arms are so swollen if he lost his fingers. Laughing, the man replies that he stuffed them with straw just so he wouldn't feel so empty. Then the big guy grabs the bandaged arm. The sick man warns that he'll regret seeing what's under there. Even so, the barbarian squeezes hard, bursting the bandages and making the guide choke in shock. This alien has an arm with several deformed hands. The barbarian, with his axe, tears off his bizarre arm. The deformed man thanks Kadim for helping him tear that arm off. Kadim is left confused. Suddenly 2 arms sprout from his severed arm, and he says that thanks to the big guy, he gained 1 more arm. The barbarian draws his sword and faces the abomination, saying he's going to tear off its head to stop the laughter. But the fake leper keeps laughing in his face. The protagonist tries to wipe the grin off the deformed man's face, but is forced to fall back while taking a cut to the face. The creature starts unleashing a flurry of blows, forcing the barbarian to do nothing but block. The protagonist counterattacks and chops off one of the creature's arms. The monster ignores the bleeding stump and praises the barbarian's skill, revealing several extra armed limbs, but the big guy says he's in no position to be talking. As the guide realizes the hunchback had been hiding the weapons on his back, the abomination laughs and warns that cutting off arms won't help. Its laughter ended when the barbarian sheathed his sword and pulled the giant axe from the campfire for round 2. The barbarian warns that fire won't make his arms grow back. The warrior replies that it's time to prune those limbs. The creature charges, but he knocks it back with the red-hot axe. The creature attacks to keep him at a distance, but he slips between the weapons, closing the distance and chopping off the monster's fingers. The monster feels the blow. Kind-Gilm leaps, advancing toward the dismembered creature. The abomination falls into despair and tries to defend itself, but the protagonist has already broken through its guard and tears off 2 more arms. The creature realizes it messed with the wrong man and decides to flee to regenerate. But the barbarian gives it no respite, bringing the axe down again and driving it into its chest. The wound cauterizes, preventing regeneration. The protagonist doesn't even give it time to think and already drives the sword into its chest. It can't believe it got beaten so easily and wonders if the protagonist also has demonic powers. With no way out, the creature begs for its life and reveals the forest's secrets to save itself. Everything cut there multiplies. The guide connects this to Viscount Adlin's soldiers. The abomination tries to regenerate its limbs and grow stronger, but the campfire keeps its limbs from regenerating. Kadim only asks if he's finished talking. The monster tries to beg for mercy and asks what he wants. The barbarian replies by saying that the monster gave up the secrets on its own. The creature begs to live, but in the end had its head cut off. The head falls straight into the campfire. The guide realizes the demon's curse affected the forest. The protagonist concludes that its regenerative vitality leaked into the environment, capable of continuing to fight even while being sliced apart. But multiplying severed limbs is an extremely rare mutation, found by him only in the first run, in the heart of the demon kingdom. 300 years earlier, already near the end of the journey, Gale was cutting down monsters and watching their flesh multiply on the spot. In the first life, Gale could barely handle it, complaining that the monsters just wouldn't stop regenerating. Striking them was useless, because the cleric explains that a transmuting demon spreads the aura. The order is only to hold back the horde, until the priestess tracks down the source of the aura. But when she finds it, her eyes go wide. Kadem and the troop come face to face with the many-headed Hydra. They knew cutting off its heads would be useless, so Melissa casts a spell and imbues his axe with infernal fire. The big guy recognizes Melissa's magic as the Hydra begins to succumb. In the first run, the redhead told him to just go all out, and he got the message. Slice and cauterize each head all at once. The Hydra's heads come crashing down, leaving the monster in shock as it sees the burned stumps. At that moment, the protagonist understands everything and praises Melissa's genius. The blonde hero orders Kadem to incinerate everything. The barbarian plants his feet firmly and advances with the flaming axe. He mocks the oversized snake and cuts it in half. The demonic Hydra was split into 2 pieces. That's why transmutation monsters are top priority targets. Back in the present, he had never seen a demon with that property and finds it strange, since the creature that had it is already dead. The skinny man suddenly screams, pointing at a swarm of snakes coming down from the trees. They approach with their fangs bared. The skinny man asks where so many came from, while the MC stays silent. The protagonist knows slicing the snakes won't help, because they carry the transmuting demon's curse in their blood. The protagonist remembers the ordeal the blonde hero went through in the first life. While the merchant sees the snakes blocking the route, they spread through the forest, surrounding the group. The merchant panics, but the barbarian already understands the trap. He remembers his former allies falling for the same tactic, realizing that the snakes guide them to whoever rules the forest. Then he turns to the guide and tells the guy to stay behind, preparing a torch. If things go south, he's supposed to burn everything and run. The barbarian warns that there's no time for explanations. If he doesn't obey, they'll both die right there. The guide is sure they're done for, but obeys immediately. He strikes the stones together to make fire, while the protagonist watches the area. The barbarian takes the lead, already drawing his sword. The demonic energy grows denser and denser, revealing a red swamp. At the base of a dead tree, two eyes shine in the darkness. From the darkness, the creature speaks, saying it spent years hiding to recover its power. Then several red eyes light up. A gigantic head emerges, revealing a colossal hydra. One of the heads opens its mouth and smiles, saying it waited a long time, calling Kadem the son of the devastated earth. Kadem looks tiny before the creature, confirming that his bad feeling was right. The hydra mocks him, asking where his old allies are, and the barbarian clenches his fist in rage. He demands to know how this plague survived, but the monster shoots back that he killed its subordinate. Kadem asks who it's talking about, until he realizes it means the leper Nazran. The hydra explains that it devoured all the poor wretch's despair, using it to evolve and grow new horns. Kadem realizes it is now a high-rank demon, but the mark at the base of the horns shows the transformation is recent. The protagonist realizes the leper's death was the trigger for that, understanding that without the items and team from the first run, facing a perfect demon would be suicide. The creature stares at him and asks how a human is still alive after 300 years. The hydra sneers, asking if he received a blessing from his rusty god, but Kadem remains silent. The monster notices the lack of response and reveals that he is not the only survivor from that time. The barbarian freezes on the spot, realizing his former allies might also be alive. The protagonist grips his sword, thinking it's a bluff, but the image of his old team weighs on his mind, making him demand to know if the creature saw the others. The hydra laughs and says it can tell him, but not for free, pointing at the trembling merchant and mocking the fact that the protagonist walks around with trash like that. But it admits the skinny guy's obsession with life is interesting, ordering them to bring him to it. The protagonist freezes, then the monster demands that he tear out the poor man's eyes, tongue, and limbs in front of it. The barbarian grits his teeth, while the skinny man accepts that he may die. The hydra swears that demons do not break contracts, and asks if he has grown attached to the useless man. He denies any attachment, saying he feels disgusted with himself for hesitating. Tightening his grip on the sword hilt, he remembers that demons exist only to be torn apart. Then he points the blade at the creature's face, and warns that if it talks it will die faster. The monster thinks for a moment, and the beast attacks the barbarian since he wants to die. The barbarian jumps back, dodging the lunge that shatters the ground. Then he counterattacks with his sword, trying to cut the creature's neck. But he is surprised to see that he didn't leave even a scratch on the scales. The monster mocks him, asking if he brought a kitchen knife, and moves in to bite him. Kadim retreats, narrowly avoiding the bite, but a second head attacks from the side, forcing him to raise his sword, but he is startled when the weapon crumbles to dust on impact. The blow sends him flying back, but he gets up immediately. The monster finds the reaction strange, but advances with two heads. The MC dashes forward, letting the attack hit only the ground, and landing unharmed in front of it. The hydra cannot understand how he has not aged in 300 years, asking why he is so weak, until it realizes the truth, while the barbarian stares at it in silence. The hydra asks if he lost his strength, and laughs at his expression. The monster says he should have accepted the offer to die, knowing where his friends are. Then it attacks with everything it has. He feels his ribs breaking and his breathing grow heavy, but realizes he has already bought enough time. A figure appears in the darkness, running with a torch. The protagonist starts running and asks if it isn't going to chase him. The merchant appears apologizing for the delay and handing over the torch. The barbarian snatches the torch from his hand and tells the merchant to run before the demon attacks. The mustached man runs off immediately. The protagonist drives the sword into the ground and pulls out the axe with a flask of oil. Now he is ready to fight. He realizes the monster is not advancing and that he has only one chance. He notices that the demonic energy also blinds the creature. Taking advantage of the opening, he throws his axe with all his strength, tearing through the air. The blow lands cleanly, striking the central head that controls the others. While the monster writhes and screams, he hurls his torch of fire and oil at the creature. Kakim leaps and in midair, cuts the oil in half. The oil spreads with the fire asterisk, and the monster is completely engulfed in flames. This is the only way to kill the hydra without letting it regenerate. but the central head lunges forward, injuring the MC's arm. He was caught off guard. The monster laughs and asks if he thought it would fall for the same trick. The axe wound starts to close, even while burning. The barbarian watches the wound regenerate. The creature explains that, 300 years ago, when he killed it, it made a prayer, asking for a body that could regenerate even from flames. The barbarian realizes his tactic failed. The creature boasts about its new horn, which made it evolve, and warns that even if he burns the entire forest, its regeneration will not stop. He looks at his own completely ruined arm, realizing he's screwed. The demon says it can feel his pain and despair, but he raises his gaze and asks, "Pain and despair? Ever since he fell into this world, every second has been like that." The MC had an ace up his sleeve. He strikes the dragon with his sword by piercing his own arm. The creature thinks he has gone mad by stabbing his own arm, but soon it sees the flesh regenerating and asks how that is possible. The MC only warns that the game is far from over, while the Hydra surrounds him with several heads. Even the barbarian is surprised. The sword's vampirism shouldn't heal him that much. He clenches his newly regenerated fist, realizing the weapon transfers to him the regeneration it stole, which makes him immortal as long as the sword drinks blood. The Hydra is stunned when it feels the pressure of the barbarian's aura, recognizing the same sensation from 300 years ago, in the demon realm. It charges forward screaming, certain it is the Hydra's regeneration coming from demon blood, but he does not retreat an inch. He flexes his already healed arm, grips the sword tightly, and carves a brutal slash across the monster's face. The blow makes the creature's eye go wide as blood gushes from the wound. The barbarian kept tearing the heads off one by one, even with Kadim supposedly powerless. Desperate, the snake tries to strike, and he drives the sword in again into the monster's neck, and attacks without even thinking. But nothing was working out for it, so it changed plans. Now that his leg is fucked up, 3 heads lunge forward, drooling, but the MC was unstoppable. The monster mocks that Kadim is much weaker than in the past, and that he will collapse from exhaustion, but he smiles and continues the massacre, but he keeps shredding everything. The Hydra expects him to collapse, but only gets beaten more. Soon it realizes this guy does not get tired and is healing very fast. The monster asks why. Kadim warns that its regeneration seems to have a limit. The creature screams that its regeneration has no limits, but he smiles and says he needs to recover something from that head. The 3 heads lunge again, but slam face first into the ground. The barbarian is already leaping and brings the sword down with all his might. The creature lets out a scream when the MC drives the sword into the middle of its head. When he tries to pull the weapon out, he realizes the blade is stuck. The creature panics, certain it is going to die again, throwing all its heads at him. Kadim does not blink. The serpents lunge to tear him apart, but he raises his bare hand and sinks it into one of their eyes. The others take advantage of the opening and bite into him. When he tries to pull the weapon out, he pulls his axe out from inside the monster's head, which tears the serpents apart. He realizes the main head is no longer regenerating properly. With his sword, he demands that the creature explain how it came back to life and where his companion is. It says that with its lackeys, the ending would have been different, but admits it cannot handle the barbarian alone. With no patience for talk, he drives the blade into its skull again and prepares another strike, demanding an answer. The MC keeps shouting for an answer and striking without stopping. He realizes he has absorbed too much demon blood through the sword, almost losing his sanity. As he pulls the weapon back out, he steps on the creature and warns that it does not have permission to die, crushing the beast's face into the ground. Then he tells the monster to choose its next words carefully if it does not want to be tortured. The snake laughs at the threat and says it is going to die anyway, so it decides to answer just to see the MC's reaction. It repeats the questions about the resurrection and that so-called companion, warning that it all comes down to a single answer. The person who resurrected it and spread the demons there is none other than. His vision starts to blur. He realizes he has absorbed too much demon blood through the sword, almost losing his sanity. As he pulls the weapon back out, he steps on the creature and warns that it does not have permission to die, crushing the beast's face into the ground. Then he tells the monster to choose its next words carefully if it does not want to be tortured. The snake laughs at the threat and says it is going to die anyway, so it decides to answer just to see the MC's reaction. It repeats the questions about the resurrection and that so-called companion, warning that it all comes down to a single answer. The person who resurrected it and spread the demons there is none other than his own companion. Kadim freezes, unable to believe it. The snake laughs at his reaction and asks if he feels betrayed. Kadim tells it to stop stalling and demands to know who it is, but the monster refuses to answer. The creature warns that even if he turns the continent upside down, he will find nothing, but Kadim yells for it to speak and pulls out his axe. With all his rage, he drives the axe into the creature's skull. Panting, he warns that he will not let it die anytime soon, and orders the snake to regenerate. Then he demands to know where the traitor is. The creature's body begins to shrivel and twist from within. When the regeneration activated, he went back to torturing it until it confessed. The creature keeps its mouth shut. The barbarian thinks it is still playing dead, slashing the body apart in fury. He screams, demanding an answer, but the creature begins to crumble away. The barbarian demands the traitor's name, begging her to speak. The MC was swallowed up by the rest of the monsters. When the Prota is completely engulfed, the merchant tied a rope and rescued Kadem from that sea of monsters. The Prota asks why the guide didn't run away. The merchant says there was no way out. Kadim notices something strange in the ground. A tentacle appears, grabbing his arm, and pulling the barbarian back into the sea. When the monster opens its mouth, the Prota discovers that the damn snake is still alive, and tells the merchant to get back. The creature had been disguised the whole time. The barbarian warns that it doesn't have permission to die until it tells the truth. He starts asking name after name, demanding to know why he was resurrected. The guide screams in despair, begging the barbarian to stop. Kadin tells the guide to step back so he doesn't get hurt. When he feels a sharp sting, his arm was completely slashed up by the snake. His arm starts regenerating, and he asks where the Hydra is. The guide says the monster is already dead, and asks why he's cutting off his own arm. Kadim understands what happened, and drops the sword, realizing that the demonic aura has already begun to take over his mind. Furious, trembling, cursing as he tries to control himself, until his body gives out and he collapses to his knees. Sometime later, a tube rises from the ground, releasing the heavy breathing of someone inside. The barbarian, who had been unconscious, wakes up calmer, but with magical chains binding him. His berserker mode was contained, thanks to that magic. The MC snaps the chains through sheer brute force and says Melissa would freak out if she saw that, but there was no other option. The force of the break makes the ground explode, nearly burying the brute. Then he hears someone calling out. A blindfolded woman appears and asks if he's okay, promising to get him out of there. Kadim tells the platinum blonde to get back, while Melissa uses her staff to pull him out. The Prota is dug out of the hole, and the chains vanish as soon as he steps onto the ground. He thanks her for the help, but she's curious to know how he opened that crater. The barbarian confesses that he broke her restraint with a battle cry. She gets annoyed, but feels relieved when she notices the chains didn't break. To change the subject, he asks about yesterday's monster, and finds out he tore it to pieces. The barbarian gets the message, and asks if anything else happened, receiving only silence from the two of them. Kadim admits the question was stupid, since they wouldn't have chained him up for no reason. He apologizes, saying it's getting harder and harder to control himself. Shirl begs him to stay, promising to find a cure for the demonic blood. Melissa calls Shirl an idiot for worrying more about him than about his own injured eyes. Kadim brushes it off and asks where the merchant is. The platinum blonde replies that the merchant went to say his morning prayers. He takes the chance to ask about Gale. Melissa frowns and says he went off to revive demons again. Kadim freezes on the spot, asking her to repeat that. The redhead turns her face away, laughing, and her face tears open, revealing a monstrous mouth. The barbarian is startled and steps back, but the platinum blonde is already behind him, with the same bizarre face. Snakes sprout from the ground and bind his legs. The creature with Melissa's face asks why he's running away, throwing it in his face that his former companions allied themselves with demons. The barbarian tries to deny it, but the serpents bind him completely,